for Taewook, someone probably needs to just make an announcement that when you start, everyone should mute their microphones so you don't get static or feedback.
Okay.
And Taewook has been educated on how he can go in if someone does have theirs on and do it himself. We walked him through that. Hi,
and
Nanda.
also, Melissa, in the event that presenter cannot share their screen, Taewook can share the screen, and the presenter can request control so that they can, if there's some link or something that they need to hit, then they can do that.
Okay, perfect. Now,
so far, I don't have any problem with that, so it'll be fine, hopefully.
so Nanda, if y'all are ready to start, it is now 10 a.m. I am going to just go dark and silent, but I'll be monitoring the room.
Melissa, how many people are there in the room?
We are looking at 30.
Okay, good. So let's start.
Okay.
All right. Okay, so thank you guys so much for coming to the session, and especially to this session instead of the other session. My name is Shin from University of Florida, and before I get started, I would like to thank the organizers for putting my paper in here, and also I would like to thank them especially for making this great conference happen again in this year, despite all the difficulties related to the COVID pandemic and also the huge snow in Dallas last week. It's so great to be reconnected with the friends and colleagues here. So the paper that I'm going to present today is about irrelevant advertising from online advertising. And in this paper, we are trying to give a potential one theory or one explanation for irrelevant advertising. And in the process, we also identify some inefficiencies that is involved with advertising targeting, which is going to become clearer in a little bit. By the way, this paper is co-work with Jiwoong Shin at Yale University, and he's in the audience. So any hard questions are his, but I'm going to just present whatever I have prepared. All right, so let's get started. Yes. So in the past decade, we have seen a lot of changes in online advertising industry. Probably, all of those changes could be summarized into these two: massive data collection and personalized targeting. So it's not a secret anymore that a lot of firms are collecting data about their consumers and even potential consumers, not only on the demographic information, but also their browsing history, their purchase history, social media activities. And also sometimes some of the firms are marrying the online data with the offline data that they have collected themselves or they purchased from somewhere else. And based on that massive data about their potential consumers, they are personalizing advertising targeting. So now the ad targeting is not just based on the context of the website that you are seeing, but also it can be based on a lot of different things, including your browsing history, your purchase behavior, and whatever you did in the past. Okay, and also wherever you are and whatever you do at the moment now. So that is what we are seeing and experiencing in the online advertising these days. But one big promise of these changes is, I would say, the improved efficiency in ad delivery. And because of that, we would expect improved relevance of the advertisements. However, the reality is not playing out very beautifully because we are seeing a lot of people still complaining about irrelevant targeted ads. So according to one survey, almost 82% of the people are saying that they have often received irrelevant advertising. And what's more is that in another survey, they have found that people are increasingly complaining about irrelevant targeted ads. So given this situation, here is our question. So as targeting technology develops, we would that that personalized ad delivery would lead to more highly relevant advertisements. And even in some cases, I mean, some of the people might have expected that as the targeting technology matures to the near perfection, they may have hoped to see the irrelevant advertisement to completely disappear. However, that doesn't seem to be what is going on in this case. So the question is, why do we observe irrelevant advertising? More importantly, why do we still observe irrelevant advertising despite all the technological developments that we have seen in the online advertising industry? So that is the question that we wanted to answer in this paper. Of course, this is depending on how you think about it, this is a huge question that is hard to answer, or it could be a simple question because you can always blame technological imperfection in the targeting technology. But the technological imperfection itself is not enough to explain everything, because as targeting technology advances, we still see the irrelevant advertising. So then what is the reason? So that is where we got started. So to answer the question, what we first did was to look back on our own experiences. So we talked about a lot of different examples, but here's one anecdote that actually motivated our theory. So I'm going to tell you what that is. So Mr. J, I guess you know who this person is. Mr. J wanted to buy a car. So he visited a series of automakers' websites. And he started with Subaru website, and there he looked through some of the SUVs that they have, and quickly he found that this is not for him. So he just moved on to another website, Toyota, and then he checked out some of the cars there, and then he got interested in Prius, because at that time he was developing his interest in the electric cars or hybrid car category. Now, he spent, because of his interest, he spent much more time on Toyota's website examining Toyota Prius. And he even went to the another website, Tesla, to check out some of the electric cars that they offer there as well. So after having done this, can you guess what had happened to him? As you can easily guess, he was bombarded with a lot of advertisements from automakers and auto dealers, but mostly from one brand, which is Subaru. So wherever he went online, Subaru ads chased him, whether it was Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, CNN, New York Times, Fox News, or even some other sites like ESPN. Wherever he went, Subaru ad was following him. So what is going on? The simple answer is this is a famous retargeting tactic. Just because he has visited Subaru website, Subaru identified him as the potential consumer who might be interested in Subaru. So they kept sending out advertising messages to him. That's the retargeting. However, that itself is not enough to explain everything here, because when Subaru could identify him as a potential consumer and send out ads to him, or Toyota would have a much more reason to do so, because they should know more that he's interested. He's not just interested, but he's more serious about Prius. But they didn't do that. Why is it the case? So that question actually leads us to the question of what determines which ads to be shown to the consumers. So we came to the following story. Suppose that there is an advertising agency that serves both Subaru and Toyota. And the agency has identified you or Mr. J as the potential consumer who might be potentially interested in both Subaru and Toyota. Then whose ad will it show to you, to Mr. J? In thinking about this problem, it is useful to note that Toyota Prius is more mainstream, and Subaru SUVs are probably relatively niche in the market, in the sense that more people would be interested in buying Toyota Prius than Subaru SUVs. And just because Subaru consumers are fewer, if you, as an ad agency, serve Toyota Prius ads to Mr. J today, then you may have less chance of serving Subaru ads in the future. But instead, if you serve Subaru ads today, then you would have no problem serving enough ads to Toyota Prius, because there would be a lot of customers in the future as well. And at the same time, if you serve Toyota Prius ads to the people like Mr. J, and thus run up their advertising budget, then what would happen is that in the future, if there is another consumer who might be interested in Toyota Prius much more than Mr. J, then you may miss the opportunity to serve the Toyota Prius ads to that person who might be better matched with the Toyota Prius. So given all of these considerations, what the Subaru would do is to dump the Subaru ads. What the agency would do is to dump the Subaru ads on Mr. J, just because he showed slight interest in Subaru, even though it probably knows that he was more interested in Toyota Prius. And that is, and at the end of the day, because of that, Mr. J would experience a lot of advertisements of Subaru, which is irrelevant to him. And that's our story of how irrelevant advertising could come about. And the key in our story is the fact that the ad agency is serving multiple advertisers who are asymmetric in their appeal to the consumers. And because of that, when it allocates advertising impression between among these advertisers, it needs to consider what's going to happen in the future. And that future consideration would distort the advertising or impression allocation decision of the ad agency. So that is our story.
Hey, Woochoel, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
How do you define irrelevance?
That is a good question. So in our context, I mean, you can think of it in any way, but I mean, in our context, this is the advertisement that the person is less likely to purchase, in the sense that the match probability or the probability of buying that brand is smaller because the person is less interested in that product or the category. Does it make sense?
But but the advertiser doesn't know how likely you are to buy, right? They're just trying to convince you to buy. So it may be irrelevant for you, but from the advertiser's perspective, they're just trying.
Yeah. So what you're saying is that their targeting technology is imperfect, right? Because they don't know fully about the current interest of the advertiser. They just use whatever information that they have, and they just do their best to target advertising to those people who are potentially interested. But our story could also go through whenever there is a perfect targeting technology, so that the advertising agency exactly knows the match probability of the consumer to both to the different advertisers. Even in that case, the advertising agency has an incentive to distort the impression. Okay. Any other questions? All right. So that was
Woochoel?
Yes.
Woochoel. So I have a quick comment and then a question. The quick comment is that I was thinking that if the consumers are seeing more and more ads over time, so even if the targeting improves, you could still see more irrelevant ads simply because there are a lot more ads now.
Yes, that's one possibility, but that doesn't rule out our explanation, right? So,
no, I'm not right. I was just saying.
I'm going to show you.
We think about the examples you use to motivate it, because I mean, you could have an explanation that still actually is better targeting. I mean, at least when I go to YouTube, there's just a lot more ads than before. And the question I have is the following. So the way you're doing it really reminds me of exploration versus exploitation. I think it's closely related. So I was thinking, what differentiates your work from that work? Is it like it's because you have a common agency, ad agency? Yeah. That if that is not there, then it's gone. So that's sort of the driving force. Right, that's my question. Thanks.
Yes, yeah. The key here is that there is a common agency who serves multiple advertisers, and Yeah, because there might be some asymmetry between the multiple advertisers, there is an incentive for the agency to distort the ad allocation between the asymmetric advertisers. So that is the story. And so what we do in this paper is just to formalize this idea, and in doing so, we are offering a novel explanation for irrelevant ads. We are not saying this is the explanation, but this is one explanation for irrelevant ads that is based on the ad agency's incentive. And one other thing that I would like to mention here is that our story can go through even in the presence of the perfect targeting technology, because the agency's incentive still persists even in that case. Now, so another thing that we are doing in the process is that we are talking about the potential inefficiencies of online advertising targeting because of the agency's incentive to distort the system. So, and I would argue that this inefficiency is inherent in the ad serving mechanism these days, because these days the display ads are purchased or sold impression by impression. That actually creates the incentive of the ad agency to consider the future impression when it allocates the current impression. So that is what we are trying to do in this paper. So in the big picture of the literature, yes.
I think there's a question. I'm sorry to interrupt. I think there's a question, and Raja, you can ask a question.
Hi. See, agencies usually, I mean, when a client appoints an agency, usually they ensure that there is no conflicting client from the same category. And even if the same agency, given that sometimes big agencies are less in number, the teams are very strongly separated. I mean, one team doesn't get to know what is being done by the other team. There's kind of separation out there.
Yeah,
so
great question. I totally agree with you. And that is actually what happens in reality. But our story is not within category explanation. This is it could be applied to across category as well. Because when I say interest, this is not the preference. This is not just preference for the brand, but it could be preference for the category. For example, in our example, Toyota Prius is electric cars, and Subaru SUVs are SUVs. They are not necessarily, they could be competing to a certain extent, but they are not necessarily in the same category. Okay? So our explanation can apply to those cases as well. So I don't think it's a problem in those cases. All right. So we aim to contribute to the online advertising literature and targeted advertising literature. So far in the online advertising literature, people have talked about the incentives of the platform, publisher, and the advertisers and their strategies, and also ad auction as well. But mostly they have ignored the role of the advertising agency. And here we bring that into the scene, and then we talked about how advertising agency could influence which ad will be shown to the consumers. And in the targeted advertising literature, people have talked about implications of the improved targetability and effectiveness of the targeted advertising. But we are looking at a little bit darker side and say there is inefficiency. There could be an inefficiency with the targeted advertising, and that happens in spite of the improved targeting technology. And our stories are similar to the agency problem and even common agency problem. And in the literature, people have looked at the relationship between the publisher and the advertiser and the moral hazard problem in this process. And they try to come up with a contract and which contract better solves the problem. But in this paper, we intentionally move away from the moral hazard problem because we wanted to focus on more interesting problem here, which is the ad allocation problem. And we show that the common ad agency have an incentive to strategically distort the impression allocation, which I'm going to show you with the model in a little bit. But before we move on, is there any other question?
Just a quick question, Woochoel. I will confess first, I am not familiar with the literature, but I do remember that our colleagues in operations also study this in problem of common agency, how to insert ads. So is there some relationship with some work that's done there?
Could you point me to the specific paper? Because nothing comes up to me.
I can talk to you after the talk.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, thank you. Right, so before I describe the model to you, let me briefly tell you about the context of our model. Okay, of course, the big context is the display advertisement that is sold impression by impression. And here we are going to focus on the relationship between the advertiser and the advertising agency. And in the contract between the two parties, actually, the contract itself doesn't do much, because the contract itself, what it does is just to establish the relationship between the two parties. But what governs the actual campaign is what we call insertion order. What is insertion order? This is a piece of document that is signed by the two parties before running the campaign that specifies the deliverables of the campaign, the price for the deliverables, and the period of the campaign. For example, if I'm serving as an advertising agency Toyota, then I could specify in the insertion order that I'm going to deliver 5 million impressions from April 1st and May 31st at the price of $50,000. 5 million impressions is the deliverables, and the April to May is the period of the campaign, and $50,000 is the price. So by signing on this document, the agency is running the campaign according to what is specified in the document. And of course, I mean, to get paid the promised amount, the agency needs to deliver the specified number of impressions during the specified period of the campaign. However, at the same time, to prevent the over-delivery of the impressions, the insertion order could also stipulate the maximum budget to be used in the campaign. So that is what's going on in reality, and I'm going to show you how we capture this reality in our model.
Woochoel?
Yes.
Hi, it's Jason. I have a quick question. Could you go back one slide, please?
Sure.
Can Subaru specify the target, such as show my ads only to high interest, not low interest population?
That's a good question. In theory, yes, it's possible. Everything is possible. I mean, whatever they want, they can include in the insertion order. But typically, the insertion orders that I have seen so far, they don't specify anything like that. Because how can you, at the end of the day, how can you verify that they have served their ads to the only high interest consumers, right? There is no way to verify that without the proper data. And typically, advertisers are hiring agencies because they don't have good enough data or the skill to process the data, right? So in that case, I would doubt, but in theory, it's possible.
So just to follow on that, I mean, you're assuming there are some constraints to whom these 5 million impressions are being shown, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there is some auditing possible, but not too fine auditing. Is that the idea?
No. I mean, advertisers, of course, knows how many impressions that have got, right? But what they cannot verify is whether the impression that they got is high interest impression or low interest impression. They could have a sense, but I don't think, I mean, they can verify it 100% accurately. That's what I meant.
Yeah, that's okay. No problem. I think what I was thinking was they probably say advertise on New York Times or advertise somewhere. They put some bounds on. Otherwise, I'm just thinking 5 million impressions is just too open-ended. That's all.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. All right.
Again, that's the possibility. But I mean, probably my experience is limited. But I mean, among the insertion orders that I have seen, there was no insertion order that actually specifies which website to put their advertisement on and what type of consumers that they want. They just specify the number of impressions, and that's it.
And there's no contracts. I mean, there's no metrics on how many clicks they should get or how many conversions they should have.
Well, yes. So there is. It depends on the type of the contract that you have. But typically in the display ad contract, people are interested in the impressions. So that's why I have the example of the impression-based contract. But they can also have the contract in terms of the number of clicks and also number of sales lead as well. So it's all possibility, but I'm going to confine our interest to the case where they are interested in getting the number of impressions.
Thank you.
Right?
Thanks.
Hi, Woochoel.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry if this has been asked again. So can I understand this as upper funnel campaign that is aimed at branding awareness? So they're not focusing on the more down funnel metrics. And in terms of it looks like they're only focusing on the number of impressions, but there's no specific targeting criteria. Am I understanding it correctly?
As much as you believe that the display ads or impression-based campaigns are targeted towards more upper funnel consumers, yes, that is true. But at the end of the day, I mean, every advertiser is aiming to sell more. So in that sense, I mean, it could go further. But I mean, at least in our model, we don't distinguish the impression-based contract versus the whatever, I mean, the click-based contract or action-based contract. Okay. All right. So,
Woochoel, so yeah. I think the choice of contract can help align incentives of the agency also, right?
True.
Because
yes.
If you have an impression-based contract, then the agency doesn't really care where they're displaying the impressions.
Right.
So you may see more irrelevant advertising in that case than if you basically have a click-based or some lead action-based contract.
That's correct.
Then the incentive of the agency is aligned because they get compensated only if you click.
Okay, Woochoel, why don't you just show the model? Because I think this is a irrelevant questions. This is irrelevant advertising. So, but all the comments are well taken, and actually we are not really blindly saying that yes, there is of course there should be targeting, and the agents should deliver a high relevant people impression. But what's the high relevant? That's really hard to measure. But anyway, that's already incorporated. And actually, extension we just address a little bit of a different contract, but I don't think Woochoel, given these questions, you don't have time to get there. But why don't you show the model? That's much clearer. You can clarify.
Sure. Yeah. But I mean, just to briefly comment on that question, yes, that's an important consideration. But in this problem, we wanted to focus on the source of the distortion. That is actually coming from the allocation problem. So we wanted to focus on the allocation problem, even though we know that the incentive-based alignment is another big problem. We are not going to deal with that issue in this paper, and I'm going to show you how we model it to abstract away from that issue. All right, so consumers in our model are uniformly distributed along the unit line, and at the two ends of the unit line, there are two advertisers who wish to sell their products to the consumers through, and they can sell the product when they could reach to the consumers through the display advertisement. And whenever there is an advertisement, the consumer buys the advertised product if and only if the product matches her specific needs. In that sense, the sales occurs with the probability that the product matches the consumer's needs. Then match probability matters. So here's the match probability. So just as in the standard hoteling model, the match probability here is the highest at the product's location, either 0 or 1. And then as consumers move away from that location, the match probability decreases. And as I said earlier, we consider two advertisers who are asymmetric, like Toyota and Subaru. And Toyota is more mainstream, and Subaru is more niche. So we are going to capture that in our model by saying that mainstream advertisers like Toyota have a maximum match probability of 1, so that everybody in the market can have the positive match probability with that product, because everybody in the market has some interest in that product. That's the mainstream advertiser. And for the niche advertiser, we are saying that the maximum match probability is just alpha, that's less than 1, so that the people in the market who are located between 0 and alpha, they have some positive match probability, but beyond that, people have 0 match probability whatsoever because they are not interested in that product. In that sense, it's a niche advertiser. So that is the match probability. Now, the important part is the impression allocation. And we consider an advertising agency who serves both Toyota and Subaru. And this guy is, when it allocates the impression, there are two important considerations from the reality. One is that no advertiser in reality can buy every impression of the market. So in that sense, advertisers are budget constrained. And another thing is that advertising agency, when it have the contract with multiple advertisers, they specify the number of impressions that they are going to deliver. So they have to meet that requirement. That is the contractual obligation. So to capture these realities, what we have done is to consider 2 consumer impressions coming over 2 periods. So one impression per period, and ad agency allocates each impression in each period to one of these 2 advertisers. And here, because of the advertiser's budget constraint, each advertiser can buy only up to 1 impression, but not 2. And because of the agency's contractual obligation, it has to deliver at least 1 impression to each advertiser. And given that consideration, the advertising agency allocates impression with the perfect knowledge of the location of the impression, consumer impression. And here we are assuming this just to show that our story can go through even in the presence of the perfect targeting technology, but even with the imperfect knowledge of the consumer impression, the same thing can happen. So to complete the agency's problem, here is the profit. So both advertisers, when they make a sale, they receive the same margin, which we just normalize to 1. So their expected profit is just going to be same as match probability, because that's the probability of making a sale. And then the agency extracts all the surplus from advertisers. Of course, as Nanda mentioned, I mean, in reality, there could be a lot of various types of the contracts, pricing contracts between the agency and the advertiser. But here, our focus is to look at the allocation problem without being distracted by all the issues with the moral hazard and contracting problem. So we just wanted to keep this assumption here. And then the agency maximizes the total profit across the 2 periods by choosing the allocation rule. So that is the advertising agency's problem that we are going to solve from this point on. Before doing so, let me briefly tell you about the first best allocation. So this is a benchmark where which is very idealistic, where there's no budget constraint, no contractual obligation. And because of that, the agency can do whatever they want that maximizes its profit. So in that case, the best thing is to allocate the impression to whoever has the highest match probability. It's that simple. So in the figure, if you look at it, then there is a cutoff x0. And if the consumer impression falls between 0 and x0, then you allocate it to niche advertiser. But otherwise, you allocate it to mainstream advertiser. So that is the first best allocation rule. Now, let's consider a more realistic case where advertisers can buy only up to 1 impression, and the ad agency has to serve at least 1 impression to everybody. In that case, of course, because of these, agency needs to allocate only 1 impression to each advertiser, and the only question is when to serve each advertiser, either period 1 or period 2. But in this case, if you follow the first best rule and allocate the impression to a better matched advertiser, there occurs an opportunity cost. What is the opportunity cost here? Because if you serve 1 advertiser once, then you cannot serve that advertiser anymore in the future. Because of that, if you serve better matched advertiser today, then tomorrow, if there comes another consumer impression that may have even better match probability with that advertiser, you would not be able to serve them. Potentially a more profitable consumer. So that is the opportunity cost. So the agency needs to consider that as well as its current profit in deciding the allocation. So at the end of the day, the allocation rule boils down to comparing the match probabilities of these two advertisers, as well as the future consideration, the strategic adjustment because of the future consideration, which is represented by this constant C. And C is essentially the difference in the future opportunity cost between the two advertisers. And of course, the mainstream advertiser would have a greater chance to be matched with the future consumers. You need to consider that you need to take that into your consideration so that you would allocate more to the niche advertiser rather than the mainstream advertiser in this case, compared to the first best case. And that allocation rule boils down to the new cutoff X bar, which can be probably better explained in the following figure. So let's look at the figure here. So this is the allocation rule. In the first place, X0 was the benchmark allocation. And now new allocation is based on the cutoff X bar here. And that is determined by their match probabilities as well as the future consideration here. And now what you can observe here is that X bar is to the right of X0, which implies that you are giving more impression to the niche advertiser compared to the first best case. And that is exactly because of your future consideration. And you want to strategically distort the current impression allocation because of the future consideration. And that is what's happening here. And there is an important implication of this to the consumers. If you look at the consumers located between X0 and X bar, this blue region, these are the consumers who are getting advertisement from the niche product, but they have higher match probability with the mainstream advertiser, which implies that they like a bit the mainstream advertiser more, but they are getting advertisement from the less appealing advertiser. That's a case of irrelevant advertising. But more extreme case of irrelevant advertising can be shown in the second case when alpha is smaller. When alpha is small, that means that niche advertiser is very niche. In that case, what happens is the following. If you look at the consumers between alpha and X bar here, the red region, these are the consumers, again, getting the niche advertisements. But if you look at their match probability, they have no interest whatsoever in the niche product at all. But they are still getting the advertisement from the niche advertiser. And in that sense, this is a completely irrelevant advertisement. And the reason why they are getting this is, again, because of the strategic distortion of the advertising agency. All right, given that, we wanted to look a little further about the allocation rule by looking at the cutoff, how this cutoff changes. In the first place, the alpha represents how niche is the niche advertiser. So when alpha becomes larger, what it means is that this niche advertiser becomes more comparable to the mainstream advertiser. So when this happens, we would naturally expect that the agency needs to allocate more to the niche advertiser because niche advertiser is now more and more comparable to the mainstream advertiser. And that's actually what's happening when alpha is larger than the threshold. In other words, when the niche advertiser is comparable to the mainstream advertiser, as it becomes more comparable, the allocation is more to the niche advertiser, which is represented by the increasing cutoff here. Now, however, exactly the reverse would happen when alpha is small. So in other words, when alpha is small, the niche advertiser is very niche, and as it becomes more niche, we see the cutoff still increasing, meaning that the agency would allocate more to the niche advertiser still. And this is exactly opposite to what we would naively expect. But the reason is what we already discussed. Because the advertiser, the agency, has the needs for strategic future consideration, but when they are more symmetric, if if the niche advertiser is more niche so that these two advertisers become more asymmetric, then there's a greater need for strategic future consideration, strategic distortion. So the agency will distort more, and that's why we see agency allocating more to the niche advertiser in this case. Given all of these discussion, what we would expect is that there would be some allocation inefficiency happening in the first period because of the strategic distortion of the agency. Yes, that's what we are observing. But at the same time, there are other types of the inefficiency in this market, which is that if you send out mainstream advertisement in the first period, then you have to send out niche ad in the second period, no matter what. So there are cases where you send out niche ads to the consumers who might be interested in mainstream product more than niche ad. So that's another type of the inefficiency, and the flip side can also happen. So in total, there are 3 different types of inefficiency in this market. And this inefficiency constitutes the total inefficiency that decreases with alpha. And the reason why it decreases with alpha is because as alpha increases, the two advertisers become more comparable so that there is a less need for the strategic distortion of the agency, so that the total inefficiency decreases. Okay? So that's pretty much the main story that we are telling in this paper. Before moving on to the extension, is there any question?
Dr. Shin, you have about like 5 minutes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I can finish it in 5 minutes. Thank you.
Great.
So far what we have done is to demonstrate the inefficiency of online advertising that is manifested by the irrelevant advertising, and that arises from the realistic situation with both contractual obligation and advertisers' budget constraint. Then now it's time for us to think about what is the real cause of this inefficiency. Is it contractual obligation or advertisers' budget constraint? To answer that question, we relax one while keeping the other. So in this extension, we are saying that the agency doesn't have the contractual obligation, but advertisers are still budget constrained. Okay? If that is the case, because the agency doesn't have to serve everybody, it has one more option in its allocation problem, which is to allocate the impression to no advertiser, which is represented by phi here. And the question is whether this option is going to be actually exercised by the advertising agency. And there's a possibility of that. And that's because of the budget constraint. And because advertisers are budget constrained, the agency cannot serve them twice. So if the agency sees a consumer impression that is mediocre and that has a mediocre match probability with both of the advertisers, then it's better for them, for the agency, to keep both advertisers so that they can be available for a potentially better match in the future. So if that is the case, then the agency would choose this option of not allocating to anybody. In reality, and this is what's happening when alpha is small, but it doesn't happen when alpha is large. And when alpha is large, I mean, surely enough, I mean, the two advertisers are symmetric, so the option value of keeping both for the future is not as high as serving them right away and getting profit out of it. So in that case, we don't observe that. But when alpha is small, when the niche advertiser is very niche, so that they are very asymmetric, we could observe the case of no allocation. But more importantly, because of that, what we are now seeing is that completely irrelevant ad is not going to be observed here. And the reason is simple, because I mean, they have an option of not serving anybody. If you have to serve somebody with zero match probability, then you'd better just keep that advertiser for the better future potential. Right? So that's what's happening, and that's why we don't observe completely irrelevant ad inefficiency. But instead, there's another type of ad inefficiency arises, which is what we call no ad inefficiency. And in this case, because there is a case where the agency allocates no impression to nobody, even though the consumers may have strictly positive match probability with either one or both advertisers. So there is a blocking of the transaction possibility, and that's the inefficiency. That's what we call LowEnd inefficiency. So just to summarize, we have seen two different types of the agency-induced targeting inefficiencies here. Irrelevant ad inefficiency arises when you send the advertisement that consumers have no interest in at all. And this occurs just because of the contractual obligation, because without it, we don't observe that. But instead, in that case, we observe another type of low ad inefficiency, where people with a strictly positive match probability with some interest would not receive any ad. And this is going to be exactly caused by the budget constraint, because sometimes it's better for them to keep the advertisers for the future possibilities. Okay, so these are the two inefficiencies that we have identified. Can I actually go on and finish and then later get the question? Because I mean, I have some more stuff. Is it fine?
Okay, it's your call.
Yeah. Sorry, I'll just quickly finish. So, well, why don't I take your question? Sorry. Go ahead.
No, it may stop your flow. I can ask my question later. Don't worry. Just keep going.
Oh, okay, thanks. I'm going to be very quick. So, yeah. So far, we have identified two types of the inefficiencies that is induced by hiring common agency. Then the question is, would advertisers still hire an agency in the presence of these inefficiencies? To answer the question, we wanted to look at the benefits and cost of hiring an agency. And of course, the cost is the commission that they need to pay to the agency. But the benefit is the improved targeting accuracy. So based on that, we actually solved 2x2 game between the two advertisers over the option of agency bidding versus bidding themselves directly. And we find that in equilibrium, and of course, I mean, there are cases where both advertisers adopt agency bidding, and that's when but they do so when the two advertisers are relatively comparable and the commission rate is not too high. And of course, there are cases where both of them would choose to bid themselves. And this happens intuitively enough when the hiring agency, the benefit of the hiring agency is not too high, but the cost is too high. Okay? So that's pretty much that I have. So just to summarize, I mean, one explanation that we gave for the irrelevant advertising is the advertising agency's strategic distortion that happens from the fact that it serves multiple advertisers that are asymmetric. And from there, we identified two inefficiencies: completely irrelevant ad inefficiency and no ad inefficiency. And irrelevant ad inefficiency is coming from the contractual obligation to serve all the advertisers, and no ad inefficiency comes from the advertiser's budget constraint. But despite these inefficiencies, advertisers may still hire an agency especially when they are comparable. So that's pretty much that we have. And if I have some time, could I take Ram's question? Or do we need to move on?
No, you can take Ram's question.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Ram,
yeah. So I have a question for you. It's more in the nature of a suggestion also. So the inefficiency. So you can visualize this problem as some sort of a sampling without replacement. So you get a draw, and then you don't get the draw again. So you may or may not get the draw. Mm-hmm. So one way to model that is to say, if you get an opportunity to serve, then there's so these could be positively correlated. In real life, they're positively correlated because you're talking about the thing coming up on a particular web page or a website, and that attracts a certain kind of person typically. Even if you know nothing about targeting, you can say there's a positive probability, there's some correlation between successive servings. And if there's a positive probability, I think your inefficiency will be attenuated, maybe even disappear. If it's perfectly correlated, it'll go away because you actually want to go the other side. You know for sure you're going to get one of these people, or take it not exactly one, but some 0.9. But there's a small probability you'll get the other person with the high one. You may want to take a chance. So I think the way to think about the inefficiency would be to model correlated servings of customers. And that would be true in real life. So it would be also practical. And that will attenuate the efficiency. That's what my suggestion is.
Right. Thanks so much for the suggestion. Yeah. So the correlation, if I understood your comment correctly, I mean, some sort of correlation is reflected in the fact that, I mean, the two advertisers have the overlapping consumer segment. And that's actually, I mean,
can I just answer these questions, Ram?
Yeah.
So that's right. We don't disagree. There is an inefficiency by nature in the technology, all right? But as you say, when correlation 100%, that's the situation we are looking at. Even perfect targeting, there is a still inefficiency. That's a kind of nature in this kind of advertising industry. That's why we want to say we are not disagreeing that there is an inefficiency. Of course, inefficiency because of targeting, imperfect targeting. But we just point out there is something which is a little bit more coming from the strategic reason because of agency. Sometimes the agency common agents have to maximize all their advertisers' utility or their profit. There is coming from the inefficient. That's why we are trying to address here.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I guess, Mohammed, you can go ahead now. Should I? Yeah. You have already shared your screen, right? Yeah.
So you can see my slides, right?
Yeah.
All right. Hello, everyone. Good morning. My name is Mohammed Zia. I'm an assistant professor of marketing at Chapman University in Orange, California. So I would like to thank the conference committee for giving me this opportunity to discuss this interesting paper. Thank you. So this is a paper by Jiwoong and Woochoel about irrelevant ads. Well, of course, most kind of irrelevant ads that are not related to our interest, or sometimes are completely opposite to what we actually like or what we actually looking for, right? So of course, one reason that we see these type of ads could be because of the imperfect targeting technology. Platforms and ad networks are not fully aware of what we actually need or what we actually like or what we don't like. But in this paper, authors are abstracting away from this and they're taking another direction, and they're coming up with a theory which can explain the emergence of irrelevant ads from a strategic perspective. Okay? So basically, in particular, if there is an ad agency, okay, which is responsible for delivering ads to the customer, this ad agency might have some strategic incentives to deliver less relevant or completely irrelevant ads to those customers. Okay? So there are a couple of very important underlying assumptions here, which gives rise to this strategic behavior of the ad agency. Okay? So first of all, ad agency wants to maximize the total expected match probability between the customers and advertisers. In other words, wants to maximize the total expected profits of the advertisers. Okay, so the ad agency really cares about this match between the consumers and advertisers to actually happen, right? And not only the impressions of the ads to be delivered or the clicks on the ad link. So this has some similarity and some flavor of like CPA, cost per action type of contracts rather than CPC or CPM type of contract. Okay? The second assumption, which is also very important, is that advertisers have limited budgets, so they can't afford to pay for all of the impressions which are coming during the game. This is very, very important, and it will basically lead to the strategic behavior of the ad agency. So ad agency may want to save some of these mainstream advertisers' budget for later, in the hope that the expected total match probability would be higher in the future and overall across these two periods. And finally, ad agency has to serve both advertisers and basically show their ads during these two periods of the game. Of course, others relax this assumption later and show that although the ad agency's incentives to show irrelevant ads would be a little bit lower, but it would not completely disappear, right? So given these assumptions, we see that in equilibrium, if the mainstream firm, okay, is sufficiently different from the other firm, the niche firm, then the ad agency may want to show completely irrelevant ad to the customer in the first period, okay, the customer who are kind of in the middle of the hoteling line, right? So basically to save the mainstream advertiser's budget for later, for the second period, and also of course to fulfill its obligation, its commitment to serve the niche advertiser. Okay, and this strategic behavior will maximize the overall probability of match between the customers and two firms across these two periods. Okay. I think this is an interesting theory, and then authors have two different extensions. In the first one, they relax the fact that agency has this obligation to serve both advertisers, and they show that sometimes it's possible that in equilibrium agency would not show any ads in the first period, right, and save both advertisers' budget for later, for the second period. And also in the second extension, they allow advertisers to bid for impressions directly themselves, okay, without using the ad agency, and they show that irrelevant ads still might emerge.
Excuse me, you have about 3 minutes.
Sure. All right. So now I would like to share just a few thoughts about the assumptions and the story of the paper, which hopefully would be useful for them down the road. So one important assumption of the paper is about limited and equal advertising budgets, right? So one might argue that the mainstream advertiser, the larger advertiser, they're usually, larger, financially more powerful and strong firms, which might have larger ad budgets, right? So if that's the case, then the ad agency's incentive to save this mainstream firm's budget for later, okay, might be a little bit lower or even zero. So that's something to consider. A second thought is related to the this two-period, two-impression opportunity for advertisers and ad agency which exists in the model. Suppose for a moment that there are more periods and more impressions coming, but advertisers still have 1 unit of budget. Okay, so it seems to me that the ad agency then would have more opportunities to show relevant ads to the customers. Okay, and so the probability that an irrelevant ad being displayed to the customer would significantly diminish. Okay, in other words, the fact that advertisers' budgets is only a very small fraction of the impression opportunities during the game would basically lower the ad agency's incentive to engage in this strategic behavior, which would result in display of irrelevant. Okay. Another point that I wanted to make is regarding this alpha parameter, which captures the asymmetry between the mainstream and the other firm. It was a little bit difficult for me to understand and interpret the meaning and the nature of this asymmetry between the firms. First, I thought that it's similar to something like the vertical dimension or quality differences between two firms. For example, the mainstream firm is a higher quality product than the other firm. But then I thought that, shouldn't this quality advantage result in a premium price for the mainstream firm, which would eventually result in a lower chance of the customer being matched with the mainstream firm. So maybe, the source and nature of this asymmetry need to be justified a little bit better, right? Because, the horizontal differentiation is already in the model, so telling model, and the customers are uniformly distributed. So that's already there, okay? Another thought is about the repercussions for ad agency due to intentionally, delivering completely irrelevant ads. Is it even legal in practice to do that? What if the niche advertiser actually finds out about it, right? So delivering an ad to a customer that has like zero match probability might be a little bit, risky or aggressive strategy for the ad agency and might have some future consequences for the ad agency. And finally, I thought maybe we can step back a little bit and think about the irrelevant ads and, whether they're coming because of this strategic behavior of the ad agencies, or they are just, the unintended consequences of suboptimal or completely wrong decisions of advertisers, right? The decisions that they make when they're setting up their ad campaigns. For example, advertisers might choose completely wrong keywords or very high bids or accelerated ad delivery setting strategy in their campaigns, or even a very, imperfect target groups when they're choosing their targeting strategy in different platforms and ad. So all of which could contribute to delivery of irrelevant ads to the final customer. So it would be nice if others could find some quotes, some articles, some anecdotal evidence indicating that this strategic behavior of ad agencies is really happening, and they might be engaging in this kind of strategic behavior. Thank you so much.
So Nada, can you see my slides?
I can see your slide.
Okay,
Yeah,
that's
we
great.
can see your slides.
So, and it's moving, right?
Yeah, it's moving.
Yeah, that's great. So shall I start, or to have a 5-minute water break or restroom break, or?
Go for it.
Sure. Okay. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. And this is Ruitong Wang from Tongji University in Shanghai, China. And actually, it is 1:03 a.m. in the morning of Shanghai, and it's a Saturday morning. But trust me, I'm still very excited to have this opportunity to share my research with you. So I'd like to thank the conference organizer to give me this opportunity to reconnect with my colleague. So today,
sorry, just a quick question. I don't see the screen anymore. I don't know if anyone else is facing the same problem.
Yeah, I don't see the slide either.
Yeah. Let me.
So sometimes when I log out and log back in, I can see it. I just wanted to see if it's a common.
What about now?
Yeah, now I can see it. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Now it's something else. I see the whole.
Can you see the screen?
Actually, can I share the slide and you can take control?
No, I'll tell you what's happening. I think he has multiple screens, so you just have to share the right screen. So when you hit presentation mode, basically what happens is you got The full presentation on one screen. Do you have multiple screens?
I have only one screen actually.
Okay. Then maybe you want to give it to Yiju.
So
Ruitong, can I like share and you try to like take control?
let me try that again, okay?
All right.
Sure. So presentation.
It worked the first time. Yeah, it works now.
And what about now?
It works.
Perfect. Perfect.
Okay, so going back to my presentation. So today I would like to talk about this prominent retailer and intra-brand competition. This is a joint work with Yiju and George Zhang, both from University of Minnesota, and it is where I graduated about a year ago. So this is currently a working paper and a revision, so any comments would be extremely appreciated. So let me start. So after this pandemic, I guess one of the many things people would like to do is to travel. So do I. And to prepare for it, I even bought a book, The Bucket List, to prepare for my future travel plan. And when I bought this book, The Bucket List, the same book is available on different online retailers, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Target, and it is sold at different prices. So here I knew exactly what I want to buy. I might still search across retailers for a better price. And in the channel literature, we call this the intra-brand setting. The identical product is sold across retailers. And amongst these retailers, guess which one I start my search? Without surprise, it was Amazon. I have this tendency to start with Amazon because I'm familiar with it, and it is even on my front page. And I'm not alone here. Internet search traffic is heavily concentrated on Amazon. And one important feature of such concentration is the percentage of consumer who start their search with Amazon. Take the book market, for example, around 65% of consumers are like me. We start with Amazon. In an aggregate level, over all product category, around 44% of consumers start their search at Amazon. In this research, I will call this phenomenon of search traffic concentration the phenomenon of prominence, and I will use these two terms interchangeably. And I will denote this online leading retailer that dominates internet search traffic, the prominent retailer. Such prominent retailer can be Amazon in the US or Alibaba in China. This search traffic concentration raises a lot of public concerns. And this concern in general echoes the concern on market concentration. The public worry that this prominent retailer can use this search traffic advantage to exploit consumers and stifle competition. However, search traffic concentration is not exactly the same as the market concentration. The firm needs to price properly in order to convert search traffic to sales. So after considering the search, it is not entirely clear the ramification of search traffic concentration. And in this research, I'm going to provide a framework to help us understand the impact of search traffic concentration in the intra-brand setting. And we are interested in the following interrelated research question. First, in the intra-brand setting, how does a prominent retailer price? Should they charge a high or low price relative to its competitors? Second, what is the impact of prominence on the retailer's profit? Intuitively, we would believe that prominence brings more customer, brings more demand, so it should be beneficial. However, is it possible that prominence might hurt retailer after considering the intra-brand competition? The last research question goes back to this policy debate. Is search traffic concentration a big concern in this intra-brand setting? Will search traffic concentration threaten market competition and harm consumers? And before we dig deep into the model, let me provide some result preview and some contribution of this paper. First, we find that in general, this prominent retailer will charge a high price relative to its competitors when consumers are aware of all retailers on the market. Second, we find that there exists a pro-competitive effect of search traffic concentration. That is, search traffic concentration can encourage competition, lower average prices on the market, and benefit consumers in the intra-brand setting. Lastly, we find that there is a curse of prominence, such that more traffic can actually reduce this prominent retailer's profit in some cases. So in the rest of this presentation, I'm going to show you how we get this result. And before we get into the model, let me briefly talk about the related literature. So first is the consumer search literature. I plot this work and related search work in this two-dimensional map. So on the x-axis is the search setting, what consumers are searching for. It could be inter-brand, consumers search for the product valuation, or intra-brand, consumers search for the price of the same product. On the y-axis is the search share, whether firms are symmetric that have identical search share or asymmetric that there exists a prominent retailer. The classical literature on search normally focus on this symmetric firm case and explore both inter-brand and intra-brand setting. And the seminal work of Armstrong et al. 2009 start to explore the impact of prominence in the inter-brand setting. And this research explores the ramification of prominence in the intra-brand setting. And we find that prominence yield quite different market outcome in these two settings. And by the end of this presentation, I will highlight these result differences and provide some explanation about it. And also, this research is related to this asymmetric firms literature. For example, the seminal brand loyalty literature. And this research, the key difference of this research compared with brand loyalty literature is that we actively model consumer search decisions, which yield our curse of prominence and the pro-competitive effect of search traffic concentration. And also in the marketing literature, we have this dominant retailer, and that features retailers' dominance in either cost advantage or channel power. And this research adds on to this stream of work by studying a retailer's dominance in internet search traffic, the search dominance. Now, let me briefly introduce my model setup. So we have a consumer and we have retailers. And the minimum number of retailers to capture my intuition is 3, so I will focus on this case. Amongst these 3 retailers, we have 1 prominent retailer that dominates internet search traffic and 2 symmetric fringe retailers. And the retailer, they sell the identical product and charge a price for it. And the consumer will search and purchase the product. And about consumer, first, following the classical literature, we have this free first search assumption to make sure this is an active search market. And I'm going to elaborate this free first search in the next slides to help us to understand the definition of prominent retailer. And beyond the first search, consumers have heterogeneous search costs to search an additional retailer. We model it by 2 consumer segments: shoppers who has 0 search costs with the size of a mu, and non-shoppers with a positive search cost with the size of 1 minus mu. And by the way, we assume that search cost is relatively low to product valuation, so that the retailer will price based on consumers' search decision instead of product valuation. Now, let me introduce the prominent retailer's definition. First, we assume that each retailer has 1 default retailer, and this consumer has 0 search costs to search this default. For example, I'm a non-shopper here, and Amazon is my default. So I have a positive search cost to search all retailers except my default, except Amazon. Why? Because I'm familiar with it. It's on my front page, so I can go there easily. Also, Amazon document all my mailing information and billing information, so I can search and buy at Amazon easily. And because of this 0 search cost to default, each consumer will start with her default. And different consumers can have different defaults. Amazon is my default, but Target might be some other people's default. And we use this alpha I to denote that percentage of consumers to take retailer I as the default. And now I can formally introduce the definition of prominent retailer. It is the retailer that has the highest percentage of the consumer who take it as the default. So this prominent retailer has the highest first search share. Okay, and let me use the, sure.
Yeah. A quick question. So when you endogenize the pricing, and is this default search behavior optimal for a consumer?
Good question. It is optimal for the consumer because consumer is expected utility is weakly higher at searching the default compared with searching other retailers.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for the clarification. And here is a visualization of the prominent retailers. The x-axis is the two consumer segment. The y-axis is the first search share. The prominent retailer has the highest first search share than any other individual retailer, any other individual fringe. Okay, and let me summarize my model setup by introducing the sequence of a game. So stage 1, retailer set the price simultaneously. Stage two, consumer make search and purchase decisions. And consumers' search decisions and retailers' pricing decisions will be based on their belief on the other's strategy. And such belief must be consistent with the equilibrium outcome. So the equilibrium concept we are using is a perfect Bayesian equilibrium. So I believe this ends my model setup. Any questions? Then I will proceed. So let me provide some stepstone to my final outcome, final result. First, there's no pure strategy equilibrium exists. That is to say, in equilibrium, not all retailer will charge one single price. So at least some of or all the retailers will play a mixed strategy that randomize their price within interval following the cumulative price distribution FP. And the implication of it is the intra-brand price disperse, and this explains why consumer need to search for price, actually. Then what about consumer strategy? So at the beginning, all consumers start with their default, but their subsequent behaviors are different based on their consumer segment. The shoppers, they have zero search cost, so they will search all retailers. But for the non-shoppers, they will stop search at the first retailer as long as the price at the first retailer is sufficient low or satisfiable. And the highest price, the highest acceptable price for the non-shoppers is endogenously determined at the reservation price, and it equalizes the search benefit to the search cost. Specifically, the first equation represents the non-shoppers' search decision and the reservation price at the prominent retailer. Its reservation price is determined by the price of one of the fringe retailer. And second equation represents non-shopper's decision for the fringe. Her reservation price is determined by the price of either prominent retailer or the fringe, whichever is the lowest. And we find that in equilibrium, no retailer is going to charge a price that is higher than this endogenous reservation price. They do this to lock in the non-shopper who visit them first. So this suggests that in equilibrium, non-shopper will stop search and purchase from the first retailer they visit. So given this, we are able to write down the retailer's profit function here. So each retailer actually is expected profit, its demand has two components. The first one will be the non-shopper who visit them first and that they capture. The second one would be the shopper who they capture with probability. And this probability is the probability of this retailer's price is lower than its competitors. And given this retailer's profit function and the consumer's optimal search decision, we are able to solve the equilibrium outcome. And let me share it with you. So this is the equilibrium price outcome. First, the prominent retailer and the fringe retailer, we find that has the same reservation price. Because the fringe retailer's price on average is lower than the prominent retailer. So for non-shoppers at both the fringe and the prominent retailers, they use the fringe retailer's price to form their reservation price. That is why they have the same reservation price. And also in the equilibrium, these two fringe retailer plays a mixed strategy that randomizes price between a lower boundary to an upper boundary, which is the reservation price, following equilibrium cumulative distribution function. But the prominent retailer plays a pure strategy and charge a price at a reservation price. And note that this equilibrium outcome does not just appear in this research. In other asymmetric oligopolistic competition, we can also find a similar outcome. That is, the bottom two players will play a mixed strategy to compete for shoppers, while the top players, like the prominent retailer, in this case, will not engage in this competition for shoppers and will play a pure strategy. And the next two results will be unique in this research. Let me share it with you. First,
sorry, just a quick question.
Sure.
So in some of these models, when you have symmetric players, right? So you usually solve for the symmetric equilibrium, and the symmetric equilibrium is unique. Here, are there some issues here that are required for guaranteeing uniqueness, or is it always guaranteed?
This is guaranteed. Actually, I did not bear with you with all the details to solving the model. I guess the problem here is that, let me go back to the technical side part, is that there can be many possible cases for the equilibrium. Why? Note that we can see that the upper boundary of this price distribution is determined by the reservation price, right? And the reservation price is determined by the equilibrium price distribution of other retailers. And other retailers' equilibrium price distribution can be determined by the reservation price. This is a closed loop. And the reservation price for the prominent retailer and the fringe retailer can be different. So there can be many potential possible equilibrium outcome. And what we do is we use some this mass point like properties in the asymmetric equilibrium outcome, and we rule out most of the cases, and then we narrow down to the specific case that's guaranteed this is a unique equilibrium outcome. Okay?
Okay, thanks.
Let me go to the second result here. So if alpha D increases,
can you
sure.
Can you just I mean, maybe I missed something here. Sure. Initially, so why doesn't the prominent retailer not have an incentive to undercut, go below
R? Because its profit is, a simple answer is that its profit is lower when its price goes below R. And the reason is that because this intensified competition for the shoppers amount between these two fringe make it not profitable for the prominent retailer to deviate to charge a low price to compete for the shoppers at all. So he simply charges a reservation price and stay there.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
So, I mean, if I understood it correctly, I think since you have two symmetric fringe retailers and they are indifferent by charging any price on the support, essentially, I think the intuition is there's intense competition for any price lower, right? And given that the fringe retailers are indifferent, the prominent retailer is strictly worse off by trying to compete with them.
You mean it's going back to, are you going back to whether it is rational for consumer to start with a prominent retailer, right? Because note that the prominent retailer price is high. So the search benefit at the prominent retailer might be low. But for those consumers start with a prominent retailer, it is her default. So her search cost at this primary retailer is 0. So its search cost at this primary retailer is low. And this makes searching the primary retailer weekly higher. The utility of searching primary retailer, start with the primary retailer, weekly higher than starting with a fringe.
Right. Now, I was actually trying to answer Nanda's question as to why, from the firm's point of view, undercutting or setting a price less than R may not make sense. I was just trying to see if we could explain it from the fact that the fringe retailers are mixing in equilibrium, right? And so they are indifferent between, I'm assuming, setting the highest price in the support, which I am assuming is R also for them, and just undercutting R. And their incentive to undercut is different from the prominent retailers. And the fact that the fringe retailers are indifferent would necessarily imply that there's intense competition that the prominent retailer doesn't want to undercut. If that did not make sense, then I'm sorry for taking up time.
Thank you for the clarification. Thanks.
No, Upender, that is also, I mean, I was actually free riding on your question because, you know, you were talking about uniqueness. So I was thinking that, so basically for the dominant retailer, there exists no mixed strategy equilibrium that dominates this pure strategy. I think that's what he's, right? For the dominant retailer, you're saying there is a pure strategy at R.
It's a pure strategy at R, yes.
So that means there is no benefit of mixing. So there does not exist a mixed strategy for the dominant retailer that yields a higher payoff than whatever they get at R.
Yes, yes. That is the point. Thank you for the clarification. Okay, let me proceed. So here we find that when alpha D increases, that is to say when first search traffic is more concentrated on the primary retailer, the average price of both fringe and the primary retailer decreases. So this might be consistent with what we observe. Amazon's prominence is intensify the price competition in the online retail market. And what is the intuition behind it? Let me use some visualization. So again, the x-axis is a two consumer segment, y-axis is the first search share. So remember, the non-shoppers, they stop at the first retailer, their default retailer. So the red area here represent the non-shopper demand for the primary retailer, and the blue area represent the non-shopper demand for the fringe retailer. And actually, this non-shopper segment serves as a buffer for price competition. Each retailer won't price too low to compete for the shoppers because they are foregoing their profits from non-shopper segment by charging a too low price. Look, what will happen if first search traffic is more concentrated on the primary retailer? The red area expands. The primary retailer has more non-shoppers. But the blue area shrinks. It leaves fewer non-shopper demand for the fringe retailer. So fringe retailer now has less to lose from charging a low price to compete for shoppers. And they will price more aggressively. And this will lead to a lower average prices at the fringe. And this lower average price at the fringe can lead to lower price at the primary retailer. How? Because we model consumer search decision. The non-shoppers at the primary retailer, they use the price at the fringe to form their reservation price. So when the price at the fringe becomes low, the search benefit for the non-shoppers at the primary retailer becomes high, so they will stop search at a lower price. Their reservation price decreases. And in order to keep these consumers, the primary retailer has to lower its price as well. And this explains why the search traffic concentration can decrease price of both fringe and primary retailers. Okay, any questions? And this result suggests that consumer might be benefit from search traffic concentration because of the lower price in this intra-brand setting. And now we can go to our third result. So their prominence can hurt. Prominence can reduce the retailer's profit. In this intra-brand setting, prominence serves as a double-edged sword to retailers' profit. On one hand, it brings more consumers more non-shoppers to this retailer. So this is a positive demand enhancement effect. On the other hand, this prominence will intensify price competitions and lower the price and the margin of this retailer. So this is a negative price competition effect. When this negative price competition effect dominates the positive demand enhancement effect, there can exist a curse of prominence. And when does it happen? It happens, remember, this negative price competition effect will result in a decline in margin. So it will hurt this retailer more when this retailer is already having a large demand, right? And this retailer is having a large demand when, and this prominent retailer's demand is its demand from non-shoppers, which is 1 minus mu times alpha D. So this retailer will have a large demand when it has more non-shoppers. 1 minus mu is high, or its prominence level and its prominence level is high. Alpha D is high. So in this case, the negative price competition effect, in this case, the prominent retailer has a large demand, and the negative price competition effect can dominate the positive demand enhancement effect, and prominence can reduce a retailer's profit. Okay. Now, finally, I have this chance to compare the result of this work with Armstrong's seminal work. So the fundamental difference is that consumers in these two models are different. In Armstrong, consumers search for different product valuation at a common cost. While in this work, consumers search for the same product at different costs. So these two different setups lead to different mechanisms of prominence. In Armstrong, prominence sought consumer based on product valuation. So consumers who search beyond the first firm are the consumers who has a low valuation to the first firm. And in this work, prominence sought consumer based on the search cost. Consumer who search beyond the first firm are consumer has a low search cost, the shoppers. And this leads to different results. In Armstrong, the prominent firm charge a low price to stop consumer from further search, to stop them from finding a better fit. But in this work, it's an intra-brand setting. Consumer already know the product valuation, so the prominent retailer is able to charge a high price to leverage this advantage of being searched first. And also, in Armstrong, prominence sought consumer based on product valuation, so it further differentiates consumers amongst sellers. So it reduced competitions and hurt consumers and increased retail firms' profit. But in this work, prominence sought consumer based on search costs. So being prominent leads fewer shoppers, low search cost consumer to its competitors, which intensify the price competitions and can benefit consumers and hurt this firm. So when discussing the impact of prominence, this research suggests that we need to carefully think about the setting. So if it is in a setting that search cost heterogeneity is more important than the product valuation differences, maybe this work provides more fit insight. But in another setting where product valuation is more important than the search, am I doing the opposite? I think this work works when search cost heterogeneity is more important, but Armstrong's work provide better insight when product valuation differences is more important than search cost heterogeneity. And lastly,
Hi, Ruitong. So, I mean, one of the strong point of Armstrong paper is, so the prominent firm's price is lower, so consumers' behavior is actually endogenized. However, here the prominent firm's price is higher, then why would consumers start from that higher price prominent firm?
Thank you for this again. It's based on cost base. So the consumers who start with a prominent retailer, they have zero search, non-shoppers, let's say, they have zero search cost to search this prominent firm, but have a positive search cost to search fringe. So that's why, even if the prominent retailer's price is slightly higher, it will still start with the prominent retailer because of this zero search cost.
Ruitong, but I think that's an artifact of of the assumption that you made. You actually endowed the prominent retailer with alpha D.
Yes,
right?
I indulge.
And so now suppose you allow the non-shoppers, if you endogenize their search behavior and say, this is the distribution of prices that they observe in the marketplace, be it for the dominant player or the fringe, and you allow them to decide which retailer to search for first, then you might get something different.
Agreed. And here within this model, I guess to justify my model is that for me, I start with Amazon, not anticipate the price is lower. It's just more a tendency. I know it's on my front page, so I can go there just with one click. And if I go to other retailers, I need to type the website. And also Amazon document all my information, so I can buy the product with just one click, lower cost. So I agree that this lower cost is assumption. The percentage of consumer who has like zero cost to start with Amazon is assumption. This is assumption. Yes,
no, but that's a standard assumption in search literature, right? The first search is always free, no matter where you go.
Yes and no, because in most prior literature, the free search is free to all sellers, and because all sellers are symmetric, so they will start with one of them.
Right, and that's what I'm saying. So I think this goes back to what Faye was asking before. If you know that the price will be higher at the prominent store, then why are you going there? I know your answer is that it's a habit. You just end up in Amazon, right?
Right.
Yeah, so, I guess you can say that Amazon, maybe they have better checkout technology or better recommendation systems. They could provide some additional value beyond the higher price.
I guess, there can be actually one limitation of this research is that here the prominence is more by assumption. This search called different, like a heterogeneous default retailer is assumption, and there can be many sources, like what Faye has already mentioned, can be product quality, better service, or product variety, or many other things. And I think this is beyond this research right now, and I think it would be very interesting to explore it in the future.
Thanks, Ruitong.
Yeah. Ruitong, I also have a question related to what Faye and Lando was asking. So, in your model, the prominent retailer has this dominance in default search.
Yes.
But then beyond default search, this prominent retailer has no advantage whatsoever relative to other fringe retailers. So the search cost is no difference beyond the default search. But one may think that even if Amazon is not my default search, for my second search, it may be cheaper for me to search on Amazon than on other places. And they also mentioned this like product differentiation, right?
Right.
And maybe once you take this into account, I was wondering whether that would make the curse of dimensionality even worse, or would actually start countering or moderating your result you have.
This is a great point.
I mean, one need to think about where this dominance, prominence in default search where it comes from.
Right. I guess your point is that maybe prominent retailers' advantage is not only at the first search, but maybe at the second search, third search. And actually,
right, and that's also related with what I think Lando was saying, right? Where does it come from, right?
Right. And I cannot answer where does it come from in this research, but I can provide some result on what if the prominent retailer has advantage at the second search as well. So this will be one of our important extension on the limit awareness. So it is motivated by consumer are not aware of all retailer. They have a limited awareness. So specifically, we assume that consumers are aware of 2 out of 3 retailers. So here in this model, even shoppers with zero search cost, they can search only 2 out of 3 retailers. And we add another layer of the dominance of prominent retailers that it has a larger awareness set that prominent retailer appears in all awareness set, while the fringe only appear in half of them. And here, actually one of the motivation for doing this research is that what if prominent retailers' advantage is beyond first search, is at the second search? And this help, and within this framework, the prominent retailer not only has more first search, but also will have more second search, and it will not only is searched by more non-shoppers, but will also search more by shoppers. And in this result, you might be curious whether the previous result still holds, and we find that the pro-competitive effect and the curse of prominence still exist, but in different regions. And also, what is quite interesting about this extension is that we find this crossover point, such that above this crossover point, this prominent retailer charge a high relative price, while below it, this prominent retailer charge a low relative price. And I think this equilibrium pricing outcome is more consistent with anecdotal evidence. Remember, in the main model, this prominent retailer charge a pure strategy price at reservation price, so its price is always higher than its competitors. But here, in this model, we find that it depends on the prominence level. If it is super prominent above this threshold, this prominent retailer's price is high relative to its competitors. But if it's moderate prominence, it is possible that this prominent retailer's price is stochastically lower than its competitors. Okay, so let me summarize before I can take questions. So we find that we provide framework to understand the impact of a prominence in this intra-brand setting. We find this prominent retailer can charge a high price in general. And we find that this search traffic concentration might benefit consumers by lower prices and intensify competition at lower prices. And the takeaway from it is that maybe we should not worry too much about search traffic concentration in intra-brand setting. And lastly, we find that there can be a curse of prominence, that more prominence can reduce the retailer's profit. So before spending billions of dollars on search advertising to attract more traffic, maybe at least this retail manager should be aware of this possible unintended consequence of more traffic on the competitive landscape. So that's pretty much about my presentation. Any questions, comments, concerns? Okay.
I just want to clarify one thing, Ruitong. The reservation price when you compute from the stopping rule, right? So
yes,
do the non-shoppers that default to the one of the fringe players, do they factor in the prominent retailers' price distribution in their the reservation price that you compute?
So are you asking whether the non-shopper at the fringe use prominent retailer's price to form the reservation price, right?
Right.
Technically they can, but in equilibrium they are not, because the fringe retailer's price is lower than the other fringe. So this non-shopper at this fringe will use the other fringe, which has the lowest price of the remaining firms to form the reservation price. And that's why prominent and fringe retailer share the same reservation price.
Okay. We can talk offline about it.
Sure, thank you. Yeah.
Sorry, can I just quickly add on this one of the Jiwoong's question? So I think there is several reasons for the rise of prominency. I think Ruitong was talking about there's familiarity, like a habitual kind of behavior. So that's obviously one reason. There's other reasons, like, you know, if you go to yellow page, right? So you actually start with alphabetical order. I mean, I know nobody uses yellow page anymore right now, but think about, you know, you have certain orders in your when you're browsing through things, that can be a source of prominency. And there's another source of prominency, which is certain, it's kind of bandwidth constraint. So certain product recommendation website, they only like recommend certain product, like they talk about some products and they will say, okay, go to this website to buy this product. It's very limited sometimes. So that's what actually will give you the this kind of sort of prominency in that sense, because they're not going to list like 10s, like 12 like retail website on their web pages. So all this.
I agree. I mean, your extension already has addressed my question that beyond the default search, you also introduce differentiation among other dimensions. The related question, actually, I don't know whether it's possible. I think that even the second search course is also differentiation. I think your result have this common flavor of prison dilemma again. The more advantage you have, you force the other player to become more aggressive, which comes back to her too, right? I think an interesting question would be that if I were Amazon, do I want to investigate? Do I want to invest more to increase the difference in search cost, or do I want to increase the difference in sort of product differentiation? Because the product differentiation can also has the potential to sort of lead to a prison dilemma again. That's just a thought. Maybe like the different directions of retailer differentiation can lead to different outcomes. I think it's a very interesting result.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Hey, Nanda, can you see my screen? The slide?
You can't see it yet.
The slide.
I can see myself somehow. Like I can see. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, we can see it now.
Yeah.
Is it done?
Yes, we can see it now.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Great.
Perfect.
Okay. All right. So any more questions from the audience to the authors? Okay. So first, I want to thank the organizer for a great conference and the author for a nice paper. My name is Tranta. I'm hailing from Boulder, Colorado. Now, this paper studies price competition in homogeneous product market. What do we know in this type of market? So first, let me establish two extreme cases. The first extreme would be the Bertrand competition. Under Bertrand, consumers have full information or they have zero search cost. These are interchangeable. Under that condition, we know that price will be driven down to marginal cost. And then in the other extreme, we have diamond paradox. Now in that situation, there's a large number of identical firms. Now, in that situation, as long as consumers have positive search cost, firms end up charging monopoly price in equilibrium. So you see, these two extremes are called extreme for good reason, because the conditions are difficult to satisfy. Consumers don't always have the full information, and then large number of firms cannot be all identical. So it is natural to think about introduce heterogeneity on the firm side or the consumer side. Okay, so now one way by which we can introduce heterogeneity on the firm side is to make the order of the search fixed. Okay, so when consumers search sequentially, instead of searching randomly, their search can be ordered. Now, how can search be ordered? Prominence is a mechanism by which search can be ordered. So as Ruitong discussed, Armstrong, Vickers, and Joe had a classic paper back in 2009. So there, they assume there's a prominent firm. Many consumers begin their search from the prominent firm. Now, the assumption there is that consumer search cost is identical and fixed. So under that condition, the prominent firm would charge a lower price, but earn a higher profit. Okay, so now how does this paper differ from all the prior literature? See here in this paper, they assume that consumer search costs are heterogeneous. So in this sense, the paper introduces heterogeneity on both consumer side and the firm side. Okay, so on the firm side, there's a prominent firm, and on the consumer side, there are two dimensions of heterogeneity. First, the order of search, and secondly, search costs. Okay, so let me lay out the key elements in this paper. There are three firms selling a homogeneous product, and there's a dominant retailer and two symmetric fringe retailers. Now, the consumers, as we mentioned earlier, are heterogeneous in two dimensions. The first dimension is that their order of search is different. Now, many consumers begin their search from the dominant retailers. So in the context of this paper, the proportion of consumers who start their search from the dominant retailer is going to be greater than 1/3. And then in the other dimension, the consumer search costs are also different. All consumers have one free search. And after that, there's a shopper segment who has 0 search cost for all subsequent searches. And then the remaining consumers, the non-shopper segment, would incur a search cost for all the subsequent search. Okay, so now what is novel about this model? You see, given the customer mix, so you have the price-sensitive shopper segment, you have the less price-sensitive non-shopper segment. So in a way, this bears resemblance to the Narasimha model, which is very, very famous in marketing. So there they have, under the Narasimha model, you have loyal customer and the switchers. But then in that model, consumers search simultaneously, where in this model, consumers search sequentially. So because of the fact consumers search sequentially, instead of having a constant reservation price, now consumers have endogenous reservation price. So how do we determine the reservation price? The reservation price is determined by the optimal stocking rule, under which the expected gain from search is equal to the search cost. So that is a pretty nice feature of this model. And in addition, the authors also assumed that awareness of the consumer can be imperfect. They begin the basic case with perfect awareness, but then later they extended the model to the limited awareness. Now, under the limited awareness, the prominent retailer is always in the consideration set, but then the fringe retailers have a chance of half and half to be in the awareness set.
You have about 5 minutes.
Not a problem. Thank you. Okay, so now what are the main results? So I think the main result here is that instead of having a monotone relationship between the value of prominence, here the prominence can be a blessing and it can be a curse. Okay, so as far as we know in the prior literature, prominence is always good. By contrast, in this paper, prominence can be good, it can also be bad. So that is the key distinguishing feature of this model. Now, as we have seen from the question from the audience, so the role of prominence is the critical point in this paper, and the audience raised quite a few questions with regard to that. So how do we contrast the role of prominence between this paper and the prior literature? And Ruitong have a slide that give a pretty good contrast between the two streams. So I want to add a few things. So first, let's look at the value of prominence. Now, in the prior literature, the search and the prominence are so important due to the rise of search advertising. And then, so what is the classic example of search advertising? So let's say consumers are looking for a product. They enter a keyword in Google, and then in addition to the organic search result, several firms will be featured in prominent spots, and those spots are limited. A lot of consumers will begin their search from those featured firms by clicking on them. So in that situation, products are differentiated, consumers are trying to find a match. So the value of prominence increases with the number of firms, and then it also increases the search cost. So I think what the author might want to consider to make a deeper contrast between what this paper does in terms of the prominence and what the prior literature does by digging into the drivers of the prominence. So I think one question that the audience raised is the fact that, okay, so the proportion of consumers who begin their search from the dominant retailer is in doubt, is fixed. I don't think that by itself is a problem, but then if you look at the consumer search cost, so in fact, without product differentiation, consumer search cost can be manipulated by the retailers. For example, there's a paper by Bagwell and Ramey where they talk about coordination economy. So the example there is that, let's say Walmart advertises their everyday low price, and then more consumers go to Walmart with higher traffic. Indeed, Walmart can charge a lower price. So in a way, advertising and consumer search and the pricing strategy have become a sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So given this, this paper deal with the homogeneous product market, so some kind of coordination may be there. So firms can also manipulate the proportion of consumer who begin their search as a prominent retailer, as well as manipulating the search cost. Again, so a deeper contrast between the drivers of prominence between the prior literature and this paper would definitely help to highlight the contribution. And then in the paper, it is assumed that the shopper segment has zero search cost for all future searches. Now, this assumption may not be innocuous in the sense that we're not saying by assuming positive search cost, the model might revert to the diamond paradox. That will not happen because in diamond model, all firms are identical. Here, we have the dominant retailer, so there's asymmetry between the dominant retailer and the fringe retailers. But then, if we allow for positive search cost, even for the shopper segment, that's going to affect the value of the prominence. So that's one, the author did a lot of comparative static of prominence with offer D and so forth. And then I think that it's worth a while to also take a look at the search cost. And then if we allow search cost to be non-zero, what happens? So that's the role of prominence. And then let's look at the fringe firms. Okay, so I think the fact that we have at least 2 fringe firms in this model is really the key for the curve of prominence. So in a sense that the fringe firm suffer from double whammy of a higher proportion of price-sensitive consumers. So the customer mix is unfavorable. And in addition, there's a competition between the 2 fringe retailers. And then this brings downward pressure to the pricing in general for the dominant retailer as well. So then I think the natural question one would ask is, can the curves of prominence survive under duopoly? I think this question did come up during the presentation. So under limited awareness, the author did show when there's a duopolistic competition between the prominent retailer and the fringe retailers, the curves of the prominence remains. So that's good. So the answer to that question is yes. But then one would say this is a potential angle to distinguish between dominance and prominence. So in this paper, dominance and prominence are used interchangeably, but then they're not quite the same. So for example, dominance necessarily implies prominence, but a prominent retailer is not necessarily dominant. Now, this is particularly the case under duopoly. So under duopoly, prominence probably doesn't matter that much. But then, if we allow a larger number of firms, okay, so let's say under full awareness, let's say there's a large number of fringe firms.
Jiwoong, just to clarify.
Yeah.
So if you are looking at the duopoly, then it just boils down to Narsim and mediator.
Yeah.
Because
okay.
Then you just you have loyal customers.
Yeah. Okay. Good. All right. So let me move on to the so this basically leads to the role of limited awareness. I think a nice feature of this model is that it allows for limited awareness, but then basically under limited awareness, instead of oligopolistic competition, we end up having duopolistic competition. So basically, by assumption, the dominant retailer is always in the awareness set. So the duopolistic competition is between the dominant retailer and the fringe retailers. But then the question here that earlier we mentioned about prominence. So the prominence should matter more when we have a larger number of fringe retailers. But then if we have a large number of fringe retailers, well, limited awareness play a role. So long there are at least 2 fringe retailers in consumers' awareness set, in addition to the dominant retailers, then I think the result will revert back to the full awareness case. So in a way, I think the assumption of limited awareness is a little fragile. So one way to think about it is that, so the alternative would be, how about the consumer have very high search costs after a fixed number of search? This is also a common assumption in the search literature. So even though the shopper segment has low search costs, but then it doesn't mean that low search cost will remain for all the searches. Maybe if we assume that the search cost becomes very high after a few searches, and then the same kind of qualitative result may arise. So again, going back to the issue of prominence, I think the paper does a nice job looking at the comparative statistics of how the price changes with offer D, how the profit changes with offer D. The offer D is the proportion of consumers who begin their search from the prominent retailers. So I think it's worth a while to look at the optimal level of prominence. So if the dominant retailer can invest in prominence, then what is the optimal level of prominence? So that's all I have. So once again, thank you to the author for a nice paper, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Tran.
Thank you.
Okay. Am I up?
Is that Lalit?
Yes.
Yes, you're up.
All right. Let me try to share. Sorry. 1 second. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
I'm sharing?
Yes.
Okay. How do I see the...
We can see it.
You can see it. How do I see the fact that I'm sharing with you? Is there something I can click on to see?
What do you see on your screen? What do you see on your screen?
Nothing. Everything just disappeared. Oh, okay. I see. It just minimized itself. Okay, great. But it's I just see you number. So,
right.
All right. Well, if you can see, then we're good to go, I think. Okay. Great. Should I just start?
Go for it.
Awesome. All right. Thanks for having me here. I'm excited today to be here. I've been enjoying the session so far, yesterday and today. So today I'm going to be talking about a kind of set of ideas or problems around this paper of identifying what I call all epsilon good on problem. And in general, the goal here is this idea of making as many discoveries as possible using adaptive experimental design. So let me just start off by defining the problem at various levels of abstraction and then honing on a very specific problem that we're going to talk about. And so basically a question that faces researchers in many domains and in particular shows up in business domains, is this question of how can we make many discoveries? So for example, we'll be in situations where we are faced with a very large number of alternatives. So think about a situation where you generated many, many different potential ad creatives. And what you'd like to do is narrow down to a smaller set of discoveries, a smaller set of good alternatives from which to choose some final ad that you are going to show your customers. And the reason you often are in this situation where you want to go from many discoveries down to a few is you maybe want to be very creative in your construction of lots and lots of different ads, but then you need to do testing and sampling to figure out what is a smaller set of ads that's acceptable. And then on those sets of ads, you may evaluate them on multiple different metrics, right? So you're initially looking at some global metric like, hey, how do these ads perform? And then when you get to a smaller set, you may be applying some business rules or thinking about various quality-related things, and eventually want to get down to one thing. And so I'm focused on this question of how do I go from a very large set of alternatives. So for example, in the bottom of this little schematic here, that could be like all of these black vials. How do I go from some large set of experiments down to some smaller set of discoveries? And how can I potentially do that in situations where we're very resource constrained, right? I have thousands of potential alternatives or hundreds of potential alternatives. I want to get down to a few, and I have a limited measurement budget. So to make this a little bit more concrete, let me give you a couple of examples. So the first example I just gave you is this question of choosing ad creatives. I have a lot of them, but I just want to get down to a few to test on, and then maybe do some A/B testing or some other downstream evaluation procedure on. Another situation that I'll jump into a lot is that shows up when you're talking about customer-generated ideation. So a good example of this that we'll dive into is what the New Yorker Caption Contest. So I don't know how many people are familiar with the New Yorker Caption Contest, but effectively, what happens is every week the New Yorker puts a caption out there. So this is from a few weeks back, I think, but this was they put a cartoon out there, and users can submit in various forms, including Instagram, various captions for this cartoon. And I'll show you some examples. So the New Yorker gets thousands of these captions, and they have to pick the caption that is like the funniest one for this cartoon, right? As a final example, I'll just mention this example of in silico drug discovery. Or this also shows up when you're thinking about protein folding, in silico protein folding type problems, where effectively you have access to, in this case, potentially combinatorially, like millions of possible different compounds or millions of possible short amino acid sequences. And your goal is to find some set of those compounds that are very effective. And then potentially from that smaller effective set of compounds, do various screening based on things like safety, and get down to one or two compounds that you can take to market as a drug for a specific setting, okay? So this is kind of the big question, right? Going from very large number of alternatives to a small number of discoveries that we can do some future testing on. So before I go any further, if people have questions, just feel free to stop anytime, interrupt me, and ask questions, okay? And so in general, the procedure for this type of thing looks something like the following, right? I have many, many possible experiments I can run. So in the ad situation, that could be showing an ad to a customer and seeing if they respond to that ad. In the compound situation, it could be the situation of, sorry, something is beeping on my screen, so that doesn't bother us any further. Let me just close it. In the situation of the drug compounds, it could be taking these compounds and running some experiments on them to figure out what's the stable set or the set that's effective. But effectively, the idea in what we call passive experimental design is we'll take our sampling budget, we'll split it over all our experiments. Oftentimes, we'll give each experiment an equivalent number of samples. We'll get that data, we'll analyze that data using some statistics and various machine learning techniques, and then we'll designate a few things that could potentially be discoveries. However, the problem with this, as you probably will realize, right, is like if I'm in a world where I have thousands or millions of options, this idea could be extremely wasteful and lead to having very low power. I may not find a lot of that very effective set because I'm wasting so many samples on things that are potentially ineffective. And so the idea is that we want to move from a world where we're doing this passive sampling, kind of equally splitting our budget across things, to doing something that is adaptive. And so in the adaptive sampling situation, the picture looks a little bit like this. I'm going to start off with a set of compounds, or I'm going to start off with a set of ads. I'll go out there and collect a little bit of data, not a lot of data, but a little bit of data, analyze that data using statistical techniques and machine learning techniques, and then those techniques will kind of go and tell me what to collect next. And then based off that, I'll go out there and try to make as many discoveries as possible. Okay. And so this is the idea of what's called adaptive experimental design. Instead of deciding ahead of time what experiments you're going to run, you're deciding those on the fly. And so in this talk, I'm going to mention 2 different adaptive experimental design techniques and 2 different adaptive experimental design methods. The first one is what I refer to as the all epsilon good iron problem, and the second one is related to this question of multiple hypothesis testing. Depending on time, I may or may not get into various levels of detail on this multiple hypothesis testing question, but I hope to really flesh out this all epsilon good iron question. So let's jump into this. This all epsilon good iron question, and basically what this question is talking about is optimizing relative to the best. And to really ground the ideas in this section of this talk, I want to tell you about this project I've been involved with for the last 5 years involving the New Yorker. So this is Bob Mankoff. He's the former cartoon editor of the New Yorker. And basically, Bob, about 5 years back, had the following problem, which is every week he would put a cartoon out there. So there's the cartoon. And he'd get about 8,000 captions a week for that cartoon. And from those 8,000 captions, he had to figure out what he thought the funniest 3 were. So for example, for this caption, which was January 20th, 2017, which was inauguration date for President Trump, right? So there were the 3 following captions. The corrupt media will blow this way out of proportion. I'd like to see other people, and maybe a second week will go better. You may or may not think that these are funny, but the point was Bob has a very difficult job here of looking at 8,000 potential captions for this cartoon and trying to get down to 1. Okay, and so he gets these 8,000 captions a week, and he screens them in this pretty brutal process. He wants to get to the funniest, and he basically approached I and a few of my colleagues at the time, and they effectively said something of the effect of, well, you know, why am I doing this? Like, who am I to do this? Can I do something that's a little bit more streamlined? And what that streamlined procedure he wanted to look like is basically a crowdsourced voting system, where people who are involved in the New Yorker caption contest, people who read these read the magazine, submit captions, can kind of go in and vote every day. And so we built such a system for him, and it effectively looks something like this. And if you're very bored of hearing me speaking, you can just go to that link and play around with this week's contest. But effectively, it looks something like the following, which is you have this cartoon come up, and you have a caption under it, and you can vote on whether you think this is funny or not. So for example, in this case, right, so there's like a plant here on this chair, which is I get the humorous element, and there's the caption that somebody submitted was, it's amazing to think he started on the lobby. So I actually think that's very funny. So like I'd click on funny, it'll generate a new caption for me, or it'll give me a new caption for me to vote on from these 8,000 that were submitted. Be patient, he'll grow on you. It's not that funny. I mean, I get it, right? Okay, anyways, you can keep doing this all day long. There's a bunch of these that show up, okay? And so Bob basically wanted us to determine the funniest caption using these crowdsourced votes. And the idea here is that we put this into place since in 2015. We've been running this now. We have 200 contests that we've done, and each week we get near 1 million votes. And so the question really ends up becoming, in this crowdsourced system, right? You can map this question of this crowdsourced system to this question of finding finding a smaller set of discoveries for Bob to decide from. So the question is, how do we decide which captions to show to potential voters at any given time to optimize our caption budget? Okay, so this is kind of the big picture idea. And so there's various things you can try here. One thing that you can try, which is very naive, right, is just say, well, let's take these votes and try to split them over all the captions. However, the problem you very quickly run into is, since you have 8,000 to 10,000 alternatives every week, you're not giving each caption enough votes to really determine what is significantly at the top. You're wasting a lot of votes on captions that are potentially very bad, instead of putting your votes among captions that are good to try to differentiate between them. A different thing whenever I give this talk is people immediately just chime in saying, oh, use your favorite newest deep net, use GPT-3 or something like that. A, we didn't have access to those networks at the time. B, humor is just pretty hard. Like, we've played around a decent amount about like, hey, can you do some classification on these captions to decide what's funny or not? You get some very weak signals, like you can probably figure out if a caption's in the top 50% or not after you have these votes, but it's actually very hard. And more fundamentally, in every single week, it's not like we have any labeled data for that week, right? The cartoon is changing every single week, and so the labeled data you have from the past week may not necessarily give you insights for the future week. And so trying to use learning techniques are not super helpful. I mean, you can filter on various things like length, like if a caption is too long, it's not going to be funny, but in general, it doesn't give you a particularly robust method. And so the methods we started looking at were in this area of bandits and adaptive experimental design. And if you're familiar with bandits, you've probably seen this setting that's related, referenced as what's called regret minimization, reward maximization. And the idea in this reward maximization, regret minimization spaces is you're showing the captions in certain sequence. And every time you get some reward, like if you show a caption, like if a person clicks on it, I get a reward of 1, right? Like if a person clicks funny, that means I get a reward of 1. This is nice that you could accumulate reward, but there's nothing in this problem objective that really talks about accumulating reward, right? I'm not actually interested in minimizing my regret or getting as many funny clicks as possible. What I'm really trying to drive is finding out what the best one is. And so fortunately, there is a method of bandits out there for doing this, and these are what are known as pure exploration bandits. So bandit problems are often known as exploration versus exploitation problems. We focused on a specific aspect of bandit problems, which are the pure exploration problems, where what our goal is to sample in such a way not to figure out, or sorry, not to gather as many funnies as possible, but rather to focus on this question of how can we sample to figure out what the best arm is. Okay. And so we decided that we want to use these pure exploration methods, and our model for this problem is something like the following. Basically, I'm going to just imagine I'm in a smaller space where I have n captions, but I'm just going to pretend for a second that n is 15 so I can show you some pictures. And for each caption, I'm going to let mu I be the probability that when somebody sees that caption that they click on funny. And so here what I've done is I've taken the captions and I've plotted like what a distribution is that you may expect to look among the means of the captions. So I'll refer to the captions as their means. And so mu1 is the funniest, mu2 is the next funniest, so on and so forth. Okay, so this is roughly the model. And in pure exploration, people have really focused on 3 objectives. The objective is very important in pure exploration because the objective drives how you're going to sample, and they focus on 3 objectives. The first objective is what's known as the best arm identification objective, where the goal is to just find the funniest single caption according to the voters. The next objective that people often think about is what's known as the top K objective. And so what people are interested here is not, hey, just find me the single funniest, but find me the K funniest. This is a little bit closer to what we want, right? We want to give Bob a set of maybe 10 or 20 funny captions from the crowdsourced voting system so he can look at those 10 or 20 captions and then from those make an editorial decision about what he thinks he wants to put in the magazine. And the final objective that people often think about is what's called the fixed threshold objective, where the idea here is like, hey, give me all captions whose means are above some fixed threshold. And so we'll return to this idea of the fixed threshold in a second. And so my claim about these 3 common objectives is that none of them are great for what Bob actually wants, right? And so the issue with the best arm objective is, well, he wants more. He wants to use some editorial control, even if he just has access to like the top. Like if I just give him 1, he's going to be like, this isn't great. Like I don't like this one. I want more to choose from, right? So you could say, hey, let's give him the top K. But in the bottom, what I've done is I've drawn a stylized plot of what this decay of means could look at. If I come to Bob and I just give him a top 100, since I don't know what the mean decay is like, I could end up in one of 2 situations. Either I end up in the situation on the right where, you know, that top 100 has a lot of crummy stuff in it, right? A lot of these are not so great. Or the situation on the right where the top 100 actually has a very rich number of captions. Like, yeah, it's decaying, but these are still better than being down at 0. And so the problem with the top K objective is, how do I pick K? I don't a priori know if I'm in the situation on the left or the situation on the right, so it's unclear what K should be. Okay. And the final objective that you could kind of think about is what's known as the fixed threshold objective. So Bob could say, hey, I want all captions whose means are above like 0.3, right? So 30% of people, at least 30% of people have said that they think there's this funny. As a comment, that's like around where our means are. Most people do not think most of these captions are funny, and our distributions tend to look like this one, though they can vary from week to week. People are not as funny as they think they are. That was like the main lesson I learned from working on this project over the last few years. Okay, but the point is, like, if you set this fixed threshold, if you set it too high, you say, hey, last week's top caption, 60% of people thought that was funny. I mean, that's obviously like where we should set the threshold, 0.6. Well, the next week you could fall flat on your face because like, hey, maybe nothing is funny. And so that threshold is too high, and because that threshold is too high, I'm not going to return anything above it. And so these objectives aren't great. And so what we formulated was a new objective, and it's a new, very natural objective, and surprisingly something that has not really been considered in the literature, which is the objective of what we called epsilon good arm identification. And the idea of epsilon good arm identification is something like the following. I want you to return the set of captions. Now I'm going to switch to Bandit language, so be a little more abstract. The set of arms whose means are within a multiplicative 1 minus epsilon factor of the best possible arm. So, i.e., in a situation where, yeah, there's the picture. In a situation, if I took epsilon to be 0.05, this means that I want you to return all arms whose means are greater than 95% of the best arm. Okay, and so I've written this down mathematically to make it a little bit more precise, but basically the picture I think tells the whole story. If the best arm is mu1, I look at the threshold 1 minus epsilon mu1, and now I want all arms above that threshold. So this problem is kind of nice. It has this problem statement is nice, I think. It has this idea of like, hey, give me many discoveries. Give me all means who are above 95% of the best. It has some quality control built in, because I'm not getting something that is like crap. I'm getting everything that's within 95% of the best. And it relates back to this threshold idea. However, unlike threshold bandits, since I don't know the mean of the best arm, a priori I don't know what the best caption is, I don't know where the threshold is either. So I have to not only discover kind of where that best arm is, but like where this threshold is to figure out what arms are going to be above. Okay, and so that's kind of the idea and the problem statement that we came up to. Can you come up with algorithms or sampling schemes that give you all arms that are within 95% of the best? Okay, let me stop for a second, see if there's any questions. Okay, I'll keep going. All right, so how do we do this? And before I jump into our algorithm, I kind of want to build up. Yeah, so this is the final thing, right? This is a data-dependent threshold, unlike the previous objectives I showed you. So before I kind of jump into this, I want to show you I want to create a little bit of a calculus in how we can think about these problems and think about these algorithms. So for example, and to do this, I normally try to draw these plots that I refer to these as plots that capture and quantify uncertainty. So in this plot, what I've done is again, I've plotted my various captions or my various arms, the means, and at any given time, if I've collected some number of samples on these arms. So for example, let's say that I've collected k samples in each arm, I can draw confidence around. So if I've collected a certain number of votes on each arm, I can draw confidence intervals around the means of the underlying arms. And those confidence intervals represent my uncertainty in the means of my arms. So near the top, if the number of votes I've taken is represented right here, my confidence interval has length, which roughly scales like the square root of log n being the number of arms. This log n is going to show up a little bit later, so just keep it in mind, divided by the number of votes I've received on each arm. Okay, this is how confidence intervals work. And there's some factor here like 1.96, or you have to be a little bit careful about the type of confidence interval you use. You want to use what are called always valid confidence intervals, because we're going to be using a sequential sampling strategy, but I won't go into details around that. But essentially, if you've collected some votes, this plot captures all the uncertainty in your problem, right? It captures the sufficient statistics. It's like for each arm, what is my mean so far, and what is my confidence on that mean? Now, the idea, of course, is as I take more votes, this confidence interval is going to shrink because it's in the denominator, right? I'm getting more precise measurements. And so over time, my confidence on these things gets tighter and the confidence intervals shrink. Okay, so just this knowledge of like, hey, the confidence intervals shrink motivates a very naive sampling scheme. And this is equivalent to the sampling scheme of ABN testing, where I'm just going to put equal votes on all of the confidence intervals. Basically, at every possible time, I'm going to choose one of these captions uniformly. I'm going to show it, or I could round robin over these 8,000 captions, show it to the users coming up to my website, collect those votes, and over time, those confidence intervals are going to decrease. Now, I still need an estimate of my threshold, because that's the thing that's going to matter, this 1 minus epsilon mu1. And so the way I'll do that is I'll basically just take the arm that is my guess currently of the best possible arm, and I'll multiply its confidence interval by 1 minus epsilon, and it's pretty easy to convince yourself that this is indeed a confidence interval on where that threshold is. And so, well, okay, you have to be a little bit more careful, but it's roughly true that this is a confidence interval on where that threshold is. And so what I'll do then is draw a little band around where the true threshold should lie, and I keep sampling these arms, and as I sample these arms, their confidence intervals shrink, and eventually, if I take enough samples, all the confidence intervals separate out from the region where the threshold is, and so I know precisely which ones are above the threshold. These are the things that I'm going to declare as discoveries, all epsilon good arms, and these are the bad ones that I don't care about and I throw out. Okay, this seems like a pretty reasonable procedure. However, if you think about this procedure a little bit, right, it suffers from all these issues of passive sampling. I didn't do anything adaptive here. I didn't tell you how to choose arms. I just gave my samples uniformly to everything. And on these ones that are kind of down here, I've wasted a lot of samples. For example, for these arms right here, I do not need the level of precision that I may need for this guy right here, right? These ones that are close to the boundary, they need a lot more samples to distinguish from this threshold. But the ones that are down here, I didn't have to put so many samples on it to get so much precision because I could have separated it out from the boundary much sooner. This is all that is really going on in bandit algorithms, right? This is the fundamental idea in a lot of these adaptive experimental design procedures. Why waste precision? Why waste samples places where you don't need it? Okay, so to get around this issue, we came up with a new algorithm to do this, and it is what we call the ST-squared algorithm. Sample the threshold, split the threshold. And I'm going to go a little bit into the inner workings of the ST-squared algorithm, or let me not go into the inner workings, let me explain what it is high level first. And the big idea is I want to simultaneously learn this threshold while sampling very uncertain arms and not wasting those samples. So let's say at some point in the algorithm, this is what my picture looks like, right? I have a set of arms that I know for a fact are the epsilon good ones. That's these ones over here, which have cleared the confidence interval on my unknown threshold. I also have a set of arms that I know are necessarily bad. That's these ones here, whose upper confidence bound has cleared the threshold as well, right? I can throw these out, and I can keep these as epsilon good arms. These ones all in the middle are the ones that I'm rather uncertain about. They intersect the confidence interval, so their true mean could lie above or below where the true threshold is, because the true threshold is like somewhere in this region, and I don't know where it is. So the idea here is, in any round of this algorithm, I'm going to pull 3 arms. The first arm I'll pull is the one with the highest upper confidence bound. So that's the arm that is my guess at being the best arm, right? So if I pull that arm, if I show that caption, I get additional samples on this arm, and that's going to allow me to estimate this threshold better. Knowing the best arm lets me estimate the threshold. The second arm I'll pull is the arm that we refer to as the most uncertain, potentially good arm, right? So this is the arm with the highest possible upper confidence bound among the arms that are intersecting the threshold. This is the one that's most likely to be above the threshold. And then finally, I'll pull the most uncertain, potentially bad arm. So that's the one among the ones that are below the threshold, which has the highest upper confidence bound. Sorry, this arm should have been among the arms above the threshold, whose empirical means are above the threshold, has the lowest confidence bound. And this one is the ones above the threshold who I don't know yet. Sorry, below the threshold, who I have not cleared yet from the confidence interval, has the highest possible upper confidence bound. It's easier to say this through pictures than through words, right? Okay, but basically, I pulled this guy and I pulled this guy, and the idea here is I want to cause good arms to float up, right? If I think that you could be a good arm, I'm going to give you more samples to try to cause you to move up. And I think if you're a bad arm, I'm going to give you more samples to try to cause you to push down. Okay, so this is what we call the ST-squared algorithm. I worked with my collaborators on this. I've written it out a little bit more in detail here. There's a little bit of, yeah, it's a little bit complicated to write out mathematically, but you can just think about the picture. And so we were able to work out this algorithm, and we were able to prove the following guarantee for it. And so there's a lot of math on the next couple of slides, but let me work you kind of through the math without jumping too much into details. And so the goal here, the kind of guarantees that you give on these algorithms, something like the following, right? So basically, you say something like the following, you come to me with a failure probability, so delta could be like 0.05, with probability at least 1 minus delta, so like with a 95% probability, I will return the set of epsilon good arms in a sample complexity that is no worse than the following. Okay, now the sample complexity has the maximum, it sums up over all the arms and has a maximum of 3 different terms. And it depends on 2 problem-directed quantities, alpha and beta. And I'll quickly just tell you what alpha and beta are. Alpha is basically, you look at the arm that's above the threshold and its smallest distance. You look at the arm that's closest to the threshold and above it, and that's what alpha is. And then you look at the arm that's below the threshold and closest possibly to it, and that's beta. And basically, what this algorithm, what the sample complexity of this algorithm decomposes into is 3 terms here. The first term is very natural. It's a term that captures, so it's 1 over the distance of the ith arm to the threshold. This is a very natural quantity. If this distance is very small, I expect more samples. If this distance is large, I expect less samples, right? And so this is a very natural term here. The other 2 terms are a little bit more complicated to describe and where they show up from. But basically, the thing is that these 2 terms capture the complexity of learning where the threshold is. And so the first term kind of captures the complexity if I know where the threshold is. The second 2 terms capture the complexity if I don't know where the threshold is and I have to learn it, which is exactly what's happening in this all epsilon problem. Okay, and so this is the rough sample complexity result, and hopefully fairly intuitive. And so on the caption contest, we've been migrating over to this algorithm. So since 2015 is when we first took over, and from 2015 we've actually been running algorithms that do best arm identification, where your goal is to only find the best arm. And so you can ask me the following question, which is you could basically say, well, what happens if you just run one of those algorithms? Won't it just give you the top 95% anyways? Because you can like look at the empirical means that come out of such an algorithm. And what's kind of amazing is we ran simulation after simulation after simulation that basically showed that the best arm identification objective, if you run algorithms that are optimal for that, for example, the UCB algorithm, it's not able to actually recover the set of all epsilon good ones. So in this plot, I basically plotted our algorithm, which is in blue, which is the algorithm aimed at this objective of finding all epsilon ones. The yellow one is the current best arm algorithm. And then there's a bunch of other ones in there. So basically what we did is this brown one is running an algorithm that's designed for the top K objective if I tell you exactly what K to use. And so you'll notice that our algorithm, in terms of the F1 score, which is a score that balances precision and recall, ends up getting doing as well as the algorithm, the Oracle algorithm that knows what the number of top epsilon arms is. However, if that number is misspecified, which is what happens in the red and purple one, where we run it basically with K over 2 and 2K, the F1 score drastically drops. And you just don't recover the set with high precision. Okay, and then finally, APT is an algorithm that people use for thresholds. It did very poorly, and so did just uniform sampling as expected. And in general, our algorithm seems to have a 5x gain in terms of sampling. Okay, and so we're migrating the New Yorker system currently over to ST squared, and we're pretty excited because I think that's going to give us higher precision at the top. And I think it's an objective that people in general in marketing and advertising should be thinking a lot more about and applying these styles of algorithms instead of traditional bandits, which are not giving you the inference you need. So we ran this example on a drug discovery data set as well, got very similar results. And I'll just finish with the final technical comments before jumping into the second part. I see that there's a question. Give me 1 second. I'm almost done with this part. But basically, this is a very good algorithm in practice. There's certain problems that are like very weird problems on which this algorithm can be a little bit suboptimal. But basically, amazingly, you don't actually need some of these dependencies on betas. We're able to give lower bounds for algorithms for this problem that actually match our upper bound. And there are various technical complications that ended up coming. It's actually like kind of a difficult result. And I think the longest paper I ever wrote, it was like a 120-page paper just to get all the math right. But it's a cool algorithm that works very well in practice. OK, so Ashwin, you had a question?
Yes. Hi, Lalit. I just had a question about a clarification about the figure. Can you go back to the empirical results?
Yes.
So here, when you compute precision and recall, so the true epsilon good set you are computing based on the means across all the ratings?
Yes.
Okay.
That's the true epsilon good one. So we basically took the true epsilon good set, we looked at what the algorithm outputted, we computed a precision and recall versus that set, and then we compute the F1 score, the harmonic mean of those.
Oh, yeah, just wanted to clarify.
Right. Yeah, so basically what this plot is showing is that if this is the objective you choose to use, then best arm identification and top K algorithms cannot hit that objective. They tend to flatline. They're just not giving you enough precision all the way down.
Right, and I guess also on a related point, so you said UCB, so you were again using, once you identify the best arm, how do you identify the other?
So basically we just looked at the empirical means and effectively used the same, that's a great question. What we effectively did was, if you go back to this plot right here, we just looked at the ones that actually separated out from the confidence interval at this point right here. So we were like, right, and so the issue with UCB is it's putting all its sampling up here. It's not even trying to resolve the guys around the boundary. And so as a result, like, you're not getting precision throughout your ranking, you're only getting precision at the top.
Right, and then you only choose the ones whose lower bound is also cleared.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So we use the same the same declaration criterion was used across all algorithms.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, thanks.
Great, no, great question. Thanks for clarifying that. Okay, cool. Any other questions? Okay, so I have like 11 minutes left. So I want to jump into the second part of this talk, but I apologize in advance because I probably won't be able to go through all of it. I will rush through parts of it. But basically, in this first part of the talk, right, I've talked about this objective of finding everything relative to the best. And in the second part of the talk, I want to talk about a situation where that doesn't make as much sense, but a situation that I think arises often in marketing situations, which is that of multiple hypothesis testing and large-scale experimentation. So in this setting, it's a little bit different from what we've done before, in the sense that I'm going to imagine a situation more similar to what we do in advertising, where we have a bunch of treatment ads. We have we have a fixed control, right? So I have had a control ad. I've been running that ad for a certain amount of time. I now have a bunch of treatment ads. And associated to this treatment and this control is a set of effects. And what I'm really interested in doing is finding the set of ads which have a positive treatment effect. So this question is actually very nicely stated as the threshold objective I showed you previously. But in this situation, the threshold makes more sense because the threshold is canonical. Saying that I want everything with a positive treatment effect means discovering all experiments where you have a non-zero effect. And so just as a heuristic for a second that I'm going to use through the rest of this part of the talk to make things a little bit easier, I'm going to imagine that I have a fixed effect size of delta right here. I have a set of ads. Mu I is capturing that effect, and this is kind of what the situation in my arms looks like. Okay, this is my heuristic. And so my goal is to find all, or as many as possible, experiments where the treatment has a positive effect relative to the control. And just for a minute, just for the sake of the talk, we have more general results. Just for the sake of the talk, we're going to assume that this effect size is fixed and positive. Okay. And so you'll probably say, well, okay, this is a pretty classic question. We all know how to do this, right? And the answer is like, yeah, we do all know, more or less know how to do this kind of thing. And I'll talk about what can go wrong using the kinds of methods we often use. But effectively, a little bit more mathematically, we can state the problem something like the following. Again, we have thousands of potential experiments running, thousands of A/B tests. We have the set of A/B tests, which I'll refer to as the nulls, where the effect size is 0. And then we have the H1, which is the set of A/B tests where the effect size is positive. That's like these little red experiments here. And our goal is to output a set S where its intersection with the set of nulls is small, i.e. we're making very few errors, but its intersection with the set of things that have a positive effect is large, right? We may not actually have measurement budget enough to find all of them, but we'll try our best, and at least we'll try to return as many of them as possible. So this is the multiple hypothesis testing question. Okay, so naively, I'm sure everybody will say, well, okay, I've seen this problem. I know what to do. I'll just run a ton of A/B tests. And you're right. You can run a ton of A/B tests. And this is what I call the high school stats procedure, or the naive procedure, right? Which is for every single one of these experiments, I want to get a fixed number of measurements. And once I get those fixed number of measurements, I can compute a p-value. And then what I'll do is I'll reject the null hypothesis for experiments where that p-value is less than 0.05 and return the resulting set of discoveries. And so there's a lot of very annoying math on this slide, and I won't go a ton into it, but basically there's the definition of p-value I'm using and like what I mean by a measurement. But let's not worry too much about that. But the issue with this naive school procedure that we all know, right, is that there's very few guarantees on your outcome when you run such a procedure. Such a procedure does not control any reasonable notion of error guarantees or the number of discoveries that you're going to make. So not only do such procedures, why is this true? I'll tell you in a second why this is true, but basically, like, you don't know how many samples to give each experiment, right? And so because you don't know how many samples to give each experiment, you may not make all your discoveries. And at the same time, just taking all the ones with a small p-value, what's the right threshold to use? This can induce error. And so just to like kind of make concrete what we mean by these notions of making many discoveries and few errors, there's some definitions of metrics people have come up with in the literature. So for example, this is what I call the find all metric. I don't know if there's probably a more precise name for this. I call this the find all metric. But basically, if S is the set I'm returning, I want to ensure that all my discoveries are in that set with high probability. So again, delta is like 0.05 here. So I want to make sure that my power is like 95% or something, right? So if the black is the set of all experiments and red is the same as the set of good ones, I want to make sure I return all the red ones with high probability. So I want a procedure that can do that. A different metric that people often use, which is an approximate metric, is what is known as this idea of true positive rate. And so in the true positive rate, the idea is I want to, in expectation, return a proportion. So H1 is the set of all potential discoveries. I will return a subset of it, which is like 95% of all of them, right? I want to return 95% of all of the potential good experiments. And so this is a slightly weaker metric than this one. I'm not giving you a guarantee I get all of them. I'm giving you an approximate guarantee that I get at least 95% of them. So this is what we call as the true positive rate. So these are two metrics that people often use in the experimentation literature. Well, what about error metrics? A metric that people often use is what's known as the family-wise error rate. And so the family-wise error rate basically says that I want to ensure that the probability that I even make one mistake, so that that size of this set is bigger than 0, is going to be less than 5%, right? And this is what we are normally using as an error metric when we think about hypothesis testing and type 1 error. I'm ensuring my type 1 error is less than 5%. Probably I made any mistake. Now, the issue you run into, of course, is that to actually pull off such a situation, in the case of this naive example, you have to do a correction on your p-values, which is often known as the Bonferroni correction or as the union bound. And so the types of tests that we often do to guarantee this is we look at our set of p-values, and instead of just taking the p-values which are below our threshold delta, we actually declare significant a set of p-values which are less than delta divided by the number of experiments. And using such a thing will give us a guarantee on the family-wise error rate that we want. However, in general, such a metric can be extremely stringent. If I take 0.05 and I'm running 1,000 experiments and I divide by 1,000, I'm in a world where like I'm using a threshold of 5 times 10 to the minus 5, and that's pretty terrible. So we try not to use the Bonferroni metric in practice because it's very expensive. And so
you have about 5 minutes.
Okay, thanks. So basically, back in I think it was like the 90s or so, yeah, 1996, Benjamin and Hochberg proposed a new notion of error, and this is what is called the false discovery rate, and it's very similar to my true positive rate. I'm returning this set S, and basically want control on the proportion of S that is an error. So I want to bound this by like 5%. And they gave a procedure for how to do this, and I won't go into a ton of detail about like how this procedure works, but again, it's a computation you do on p-values. Instead of taking all p-values that are under a fixed threshold, instead what you do is you plot the p-values like this, you draw a line corresponding to whatever your delta error metric is, and then you take all p-values. You stop at the first place where your p-value, sorry, you stop at the last place where your p-value is under the line, and then you accept everything below that as a p-value that's a discovery. And so this is what's known as the Benjamini-Hochberg procedure, and effectively running this procedure on a set of p-values guarantees you this false discovery rate. And this is, I think, it's one of the most cited papers of all times. It's really a brilliant technique that tends to work. Okay, so that's just like a quick summary. And the issue with the high school stats procedure, just to go all the way to the top, is that, even if all of these are null, if I don't do a Bonferroni correction, I will almost certainly say that some of these are non-null, and I get no guarantees on discoveries because I may not have taken enough samples in each one. Okay, so how you get around this, and I'm sorry, I'll have to like rush a little bit. How you get around this is what is this idea of sequential experimentation. So I'm showing you the same kind of plot that I showed you in the first half of the talk, but basically the idea here is you have a set of experiments and you keep sampling, 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 sampling. And as you keep sampling them, over time, what you'll basically do is you look at the ones whose confidence intervals clear this threshold of 0, the ones that actually have a positive effect size, and you can recommend that set. And if you do this, you can overcome this naive experimentation procedure. Like you don't have to specify ahead of time how many samples you want to take. You can use sequential procedures to decide without knowing what your effect size is, how many samples to give each thing, to give each experiment. And effectively, I can't go into a ton of detail on how these sequential procedures work, but they use tests such as the sequential probability ratio test or always valid confidence intervals. And in general, these types of methods can save you up to a factor of 4 samples over naive A/B testing. Okay, and such methods tend to take a number of samples that scales with the number of arms linearly. That's not surprising since I have to pull every single arm. But they also pick up this extra annoying logarithmic factor in the number of arms. And so the question in our work was, can we exploit sequential experimentation procedures to do better than hitting this log n? And can we go after these approximate metrics like true positive rate and false discovery rate? Like, how do you do sequential experimental design to return sets that have good false discovery rate, but don't take too many samples? And so I don't have a ton of time to go into the algorithm, so this is more of a preview of anything to hopefully get people interested in looking at this. But effectively, the idea is that we used a bandit style algorithm. In every round, we pull the UCB. And then we take the set of p-values we have access to, and we run a Benjamini-Hochberg procedure on that set of p-values. And so at any given step, we can return a set which is false discovery controlled, and we're able to give a guarantee on how long it takes to get a certain true positive rate and a false discovery rate. And amazingly, that guarantee scales like what you would expect it to. You still have to pull each arm. You still have to pull each arm roughly 1 over a gap squared number of times, but you do not get hit by this annoying log n. And in practice, not getting hit by that log n, even in situations where you have only like 1,000 arms, is a speed up of a factor of 7. And so to give the discussion a little bit of time, we can come back to this in discussion if people have questions, but basically I'll just make a comment here that this algorithm has currently been employed at Optimizely. It runs a lot of A/B testing. You can use it if you want to. Many different customers are using this algorithm to do their A/B testing, and it's bought 2 to 3 times speed up for customers that are employing these algorithms in general. But the idea, the big picture idea is relax your metric, be willing to use false discovery style metrics, use sequential experimentation, and then employ bandit strategies to put the sampling at the top. Okay. Okay. So with that said, I'll just flash up some papers that are all very related to this. There would have been a part 3 if I had more time where I talk about how to employ structure. One of the issues with this work, right, is that you may come to me and say, well, look, those captions still had some structure. You told us there wasn't a ton of structure there, but you should figure out how to use it somehow. The answer is we did. We wrote a paper about how to do that. And so I will not say any more about that right now, but I'll let the discussant take over. Thanks.
Thanks, Lalit. So I think I shared my slides with Jiwoong.
Do I have to stop sharing?
Yeah.
Am I? Okay, great.
And I just do request control?
Yeah. Can you click request control?
Yeah. Okay, now I can link it. And then, so I've never done this before. How would I change slides? I just click on it? Okay.
Yeah, you can just drag it.
Awesome, yeah. Hi everyone. I would like to start off by thanking Nanda for giving me this opportunity to be part of the BAS Forms conference and serve as a discussant for this paper. And thanks to Lalit for a great talk. I really enjoyed reading the paper. So the way I want to do this is, I think in the just a couple of slides, I'll summarize my take on the paper, and then I have like a couple of applications that I feel this idea could be applied to, and it will mostly like a discussion, and I welcome other people also to provide their inputs. So yeah, so just a quick summary of the problem. So the authors introduced a new multi-arm bandit problem in the paper, which they term as the all epsilon problem. So here, the setting is you have a set of n arms. So arms like examples Lalit gave, but this could be like a caption or a compound or a digital ad creative. And all of them have some means which are unknown. And suppose you sort them based on decreasing means. And the goal is to come up with what the authors term as epsilon good arms, right? So they consider two different notions of epsilon good in an additive sense as well as a multiplicative sense. So I think Lalit talked about the multiplicative epsilon good, where you want to remove return all arms that have mean 1 minus epsilon times the maximum. And they also talk about the additive epsilon good problem, where you want to return all the arms that have mean greater than mu1 minus epsilon. Okay, so that's the problem setting, and the authors prove like a lower bound on the expected number of samples that any algorithm will need to return these sets with high probability. And they also propose two algorithms. So the first one, which Lalit talked about, was the sample the threshold and split the threshold ST square algorithm, which combines UCB and LUCB, two algorithms in prior literature in a clever way, and Lalit talked about that in detail, and also presented empirical results which shows that the algorithm outperforms many benchmarks. So the algorithm matches the lower bound in a lot of problem settings, but there is one problem setting where it could perform, it's not optimal. So I think Lalit mentioned this, but I also quickly want to say this. So in this problem, in this figure, let's say all of my good epsilon good arms are this blue region, and all the bad arms are this green region. So this is the additive setting, and this is my threshold, right? So Lalit, I think, mentioned these as alpha and beta. So alpha is the distance of the lowest good arm from the threshold, and beta is the distance of the highest bad arm in some sense, or the closest bad arm from the threshold. And when both of these are of the same order, then ST square is optimal. But if beta is much smaller than alpha, then the number of samples might be, I think there is some scaling that is not optimal. So the authors propose another algorithm, which is far east, which they show is instance optimal for all parameter regimes. Okay, and so I think Lalit, maybe you can answer this once I'm done, but my intuition was probably this is the case because in each round you are giving equal samples to both or you're equally weighting arms above the threshold and below the threshold. So that's why when beta is much smaller, you're probably not getting the optimal bounds. But maybe, you can talk about this once done. So, and then quickly, like placing this in prior bandit literature, again, I think Lalit mentioned this. So the paper is considered a setting of pure exploration. And there are three existing objectives that people have looked at, which is one is the best arm identification. So here you would want to return arm 1. A generalization of that is top K, where you return the arms with the K largest means. And there's also threshold bandits, where you want to return arms that exceed a threshold. So Lalit mentioned this. I also want to give another example from the paper. So these are the distribution of means for different captions across 3 different contests from the New Yorker caption contest that Lalit mentioned. And the horizontal lines here are a threshold of 0.8 times the maximum, the caption that is the most fun, right? So as Lalit mentioned, the distribution of means changes a lot from week to week. So using the same threshold might not give you good performance, right? So here, for the blue contest, like the number of captions that are above this threshold, I think was around just 30. But if you look at the orange contest, the same threshold gives you like I think 600 or 700, right? So, and of course, you don't know this distribution a priori. So if you rely on choosing K and tau from like contests in the previous weeks, you might be suboptimal. So the all epsilon objective provides like a robust distribution-free metric for finding good arms in any particular week.
You have about 5 minutes.
Yeah. So I am in the operations management group here. So when I looked at this paper, one thing that immediately came to my mind was, are there like applications that OM could, in applications OM where this could be applied? And one thing that came to my mind was like this dynamic assortment optimization, right? So what is assortment optimization? Essentially, a firm wants to select the subset of products to offer that maximizes expected revenue. So you have like a big inventory and you want to choose like some subset. And the customer choice behavior is captured by a discrete choice model, which captures the substitution effect. So most of you might be familiar with this multinomial logit model, right? And in the traditional sort of static setting, you are able to collect historical data, historical sales transaction data, which allows you to learn customer preferences, and then you just solve the assortment problem, right? For instance, for a multinomial logit model, you can show that the optimal assortment is revenue order. So you will pick some subset of products in a revenue ordered way. But there are many applications where you don't have access to a large amounts of historical data to learn customer preferences. So settings like online advertising or fast fashion, you also have to learn the preferences of customers over time, right? So that is what is dynamic assortment optimization. And to the best of my knowledge, the existing literature has primarily focused on this regret minimization setting that Lalit mentioned, where you want to maximize cumulative revenue over some time horizon. But I think the authors mentioned it in the paper, there could be other objectives that you might care about, right? So one thing that came to my mind would be like something like product variety. So here, let's say you essentially want to converge to the optimal assortment that maximizes expected revenue, but maybe you want to have some variety in the assortments that customers see, right? And there is some work both in marketing and operation, and this is definitely not an exhaustive list. I apologize if anybody in the audience has also looked at this problem, which shows that product variety can positively impact sales and consumer surplus. So essentially in their setup, what I would want is I would want to find all epsilon good assortments. So each arm is an assortment. But the main challenge is that now you have exponentially many arms. Sorry, there's a typo here, right? Because if you have n products, then I have 2 to the n assortments. But there is some structure, right? Any 2 arms, they might have overlap in products. So there is some structure. And I think Lalit kind of hinted at this at the end. Maybe that approach is applicable to this problem. And I'm not super familiar with the combinatorial Bandits literature, but maybe there is some connection with that literature here. And finally, yeah, I think definitely the problem that the authors introduced has a lot of applications. Another thing that I've worked on before is looking at crowdsourced labeling and how you aggregate responses from workers. So one key challenge in crowdsourced tasks is that there's heterogeneous quality in workers, right? So typically the way you deal with that is you have redundancy. So for the same task, you get responses from a large number of workers or like some set of workers, and you aggregate them to remove this heterogeneity. But that could be expensive because that increases the number of samples or the number of tasks that you have to deploy. So instead, is there a way I could identify, let's say, some of the best workers, which have the highest quality, and then I'll just use them to solve my task? And I wasn't able to find a lot of literature that has explicitly looked at this problem. And again, the problem has similar issues as the caption contest, right? You could go by the performance of the workers on prior tasks. So you know that they had like some 95% quality on prior tasks, but this won't really generalize to novel tasks, right? Like Lalit said, like add creative. especially for creative tasks, this would be hard. So again, could you use something similar where I have like a small data set that I have annotated using an expert, and I use that to learn the qualities of the workers, and I find like the epsilon good workers, and then I use them. And the same idea of like not just focusing on the best, but or epsilon good best in some sense. I think as many applications, crowdsourcing contests or captions Lalit already talked about, like aggregation sites where, again, I want some sort of notion of diversity in what I'm showing, recommendation systems. So yes, I think this could probably open up a lot of future papers. So yeah, that's all I had. I think we probably have a couple of minutes. So I think Lalit, if you want to say something about some of these applications.
Thanks, Ashwin. That was great. I really appreciate you putting it in context. That's fantastic. So I'll make a couple of comments. So this crowd worker thing is, I think, a very natural application. I have a colleague who is trying to apply these algorithms for the crowd worker setting.
Okay.
I think I do think you can kind of use past data there, because like if you worked with a crowd worker before on a task and they did a good job then, that means they're detailed, they'll maybe do a good job again. So there's questions about how to incorporate prior data, but I do think it's a great example. You want to go from lots of crowd workers, do some pre-screening, get down to a few.
Right.
To go back one slide, so this is something I've thought a lot about, is this dynamic assortment problem. So recently, I wrote a paper with some colleagues that gets the first computationally efficient optimal algorithm for combinatorial bandits. And so that was like last May. And then I just submitted to ICML a paper that gets, I wouldn't say it's optimal, but a first good attempt at situations where you want to do this, where the feedback is from a logistic model. That introduces all kinds of difficulties. But like you really do want to exploit that on these arms. You may have some structure, like some vector space structure or other type of structure. And so it is pretty, you basically, you run into all kinds of issues, because like you can't do searches over all your arms, because as you're saying, spend so many arms. So you run into all kinds of issues. And I think there's a ton of interesting work to do in this area. And I do think, like, very practically, like, everybody's using regret minimization algorithms, and these things just don't give you inference. So a lot of this stuff came up for me because I would go and talk with companies doing this kind of stuff, and they'd be like, great bandit algorithm, but I'm not getting a p-value, so this was useless. So being able to have inference is extremely important. And then finally, going back to your very technical comment about lower bound. OK, so let me explain. This is frustrating. So the reason why the lower bound does not capture the dependence on beta, and you have to do more work, is because of the style of the lower bound that is commonly used in the literature is like information theoretic for an oracle that gets to know the best arm. And so because the oracle gets to know the best arm, it doesn't need to pay to learn it. And so the lower bound does not actually end up reflecting the sample complexity of how much you have to pay to learn it. And so that's why we had to do all this addition. So what happened is we kept writing down algorithms, like the ST-squared algorithms, and would be like, there's no way this isn't optimal. Then we'd construct situations where it wasn't optimal, and it was like, well, the lower bound is not capturing this. Like, nothing is matching up.
I see.
Finally, we wrote down this like 100 pages to get an optimal algorithm and an optimal lower bound. So, but like nobody should ever use that algorithm. That is like considered in the literature, and nobody should ever read it. No, some people should read it because it's cool, but nobody should ever read it. So don't worry about bad cases, is basically the story. The average case performance of ST-squared is excellent.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, thanks for the deep dive on the paper.
No, definitely. And like if you could share some of your submitted works, like that would be great, I think.
I'll reach out. It'd be great to chat more.
Thanks so much.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Thanks, Nanda.
Thanks, Nanda.